What's up? What's up? I hope everybody is doing good. Yo, check it. We in this thing, boy. Anacalypsis. Back at it again with another part. This time we're gonna do two different things. I've been noticing everybody kind of talking about the Jews right now, the Hebrews. So I wanted to dive into some things as far as what was spoken by Godfrey Higgins. Godfrey Higgins got a good take on things. Some good overstanding. So first off, what we're gonna do is we're gonna jump into the first volume in relation to his work. In this volume 1, 386, we're gonna backdoor it with a volume 2 and do a good comparison of what he understood in the first volume in comparison to the second. So this one's gonna be was this book 8, chapter 1. It's going to be the Jewish Pentateuch publication force, Jews, a Hindu or Persian tribe, name of Phoenicia and Syria, reason of Abraham's migration, Abaris, meaning of, Yadas, a tribe of Jews, Yadus, God called by Gentile names, but always male, difficulty in the metempsychosis. Dr. Hyde shows Abraham to have been a Brahmin. 1. It is scarcely necessary to remind any person who has read the preceding part of this work of the very extraordinary manner in which the Jews appear to have been, as it were, insulated amidst the surrounding nations. If we may believe the literal sense of the Bible, for a short time, the Persians excepted, they were always a secret enmity or open war with their neighbors, the Gentiles or the idolaters, as, by way of reproach, they are generally called. By the Greeks, they were scarcely noticed. Known they certainly were, but probably their doctrines were first made public by the translation of their Pentateuch in the time of Ptolemy Philadelphus, and its consequent publication, which was so abhorrent to the feelings of the Jews that a solemn fast to atone for the sin was established on the anniversary of the day that the translation was finished. This fast continues to be observed annually throughout the world where there are any of the Jewish nation, notwithstanding what is said of Jesus reading in the synagogue, which admits of explanation. So as not to be adverse to my opinion, I believe that anciently the Pentateuch was kept strictly by the Jews, and would probably have been lost like similar works of different temples, Diana, Eleusis, Delphi, etc., had it not been for the translation forced by Ptolemy. In Athens, they had a prophetic and mysterious book, which they called the Testament, to which they believed the safety of the Republic was attached. They preserved it with so much care that among all their writers, no one ever dared to make any mention of it. And the little we know of this subject has been collected from the famous oration of Dinarchus against Demosthenes, whom he accuses of having failed in the respect due to this infable book, so connected with the welfare and safety of the state. Menetheo notices a sacred book in the great Egyptian library of Ozymandias, said to be written by Pharaoh Sophis. This is Pharaoh the Wise. This was probably a similar book to that of the Athenians. No doubt every division of the universal religion had its secret and sacred writings as well as the Jews, only they were never made public, and thus were lost. To the peculiar circumstance which caused Alexandria to be almost filled with Jews and Samaritans, and to the necessity which Ptolemy found of causing their books to be translated in order that he might know how to decide between them and their squabbles, and to wish perhaps to govern them by their own laws, we are probably indebted for our knowledge of the books of the Old Testament. After they were once translated into Greek, there could no longer be any object in concealing the origins. Of the reality of the translation there can be no doubt, but whether it was made from a copy of the Samaritans or from that of the Jews cannot be certainly known. Against the Samaritans, Josephus is not evidence, but as the Jews allow the Samaritan to be the sacred character, from that it was probably taken, in consequence of the unintentional corruption of the LXX by Origen. Nothing can be deduced by comparison of the versions. Calmet says the Samaritans allege that, quote, their translation was preferred before that of the Jews, laid up in the library of Alexandria, unquote. This seems not improbable. The Samaritan is said to be the sacred language of the Jews by Josephus, who, in this case, must be allowed to be an unquestionable authority because it is evidence against himself and his sect. He says that the petalon, or gold plate on the forehead of the high priest, had on it the name of God in sacred characters. This plate was in existence in the capital of Rome in the time of Origen, who relates that the letters were Samaritan. Josephus was here the most unwilling of witnesses. Consequently, his evidence is good, and Origen's is the same. 2. Christians and Jews will find no difficulty in accounting for the insulated state or the singularity of the Jews, to which allusion was made in the last section. They will say the Israelites were singular because they were the elect of God, or God's chosen people. But philosophers will not be so easily satisfied, and perhaps they may reply that this is an assumption made by the priests of almost every nation in its turn. A wish may also exist on their parts to discover the cause of this singularity, combined with the general family likeness which, notwithstanding their peculiarity, may be perceived in their ceremonies and doctrines to those of the other nations. This wished for cause, I shall now proceed to show, may be found in the probable fact that they were a tribe of Hindu or Persian nomads or shepherds. For a wandering tribe they certainly were one of the sects of the Hindu religion after it divided into two, i.e. those of the Linga and Aoni, or Buddha and Krishna, or perhaps of the sect of the Linga after the separation, but before the reunion of the two. Now, I think this theory will account for most of the difficulties with which we meet, and that there will not be a disagreement from the Hindu religion in its probable original purity, greater than may be expected to have arisen from the lapse of time, the change of place, revolutions, and other circumstances. I incline to the opinion that it was of the religion of the followers of the Linga after the separation. Thus, they were the followers of the god Aipati or Aao, in opposition to the goddess Parvati or Venus, Astarte or Astaroth, etc. Think of Azeroth, America. They were the followers of the male Ao, in opposition to the female Ao of Syria, for the Ao, as we have seen, was both sexes, 1 and 0s. The code. The Ao of Syria was probably nothing more than the Ayut of the Jews, with the peculiar Syriac dialect, which changed the E into the O. We are told that Tara, so the E into the O, so it would be Yao, Yao, or Yao, okay? But remember that, Yao. We are told that Tara, the father of Abraham, originally came from an eastern country called of the Chaldees, or Chaldese, to dwell in a district called Mesopotamia. Sometime after he had dwelt there, Abraham, or Abram, or Brahma, and his wife Sarah, or Sarah Iswati, left their father's family and came into Canaan. If the letter A be changed by metathesis from the end of the word Brahma to the beginning, as is very often practiced in the Oriental languages, we shall have correctly Abram. Or the A might be the only emphatic Chaldee article, making the Braham, or Brahmin. The word Iswati in the second name is now said to be merely a term of honor, like Lady Sarah. The identity of Abraham and Sarah with Brahma in Saraswati was first pointed out by the Jesuit missionaries. Quote, Mr. Paxson, in his Illustrations of the Holy Scriptures, describes the striking similarity of the manners, habits, and customs observable between the Israelites and the Hindu nations. Abraham is said to be the son of a Hindu Raja who, abandoning his caste and native land, which was Mesopotamia, went to reside in a foreign country. Unquote. This Mesopotamia, as it was intimated in the last book, must evidently be the country called Doab, or the Mesopotamia of India, the same as the Greek. This is probably meant for Mathura on the Gumna, in the country between the Indus and the Ganges. They came ultimately into the country which they called Canaan, probably from a place in India, he says probably, which had the same name. Notice by Dr. Buchanan, and remember, this is volume 1, so we're getting a good base on what they understood before, at least on the most deepest of deepest aspects. He one of the most deepest writers in this time period. as far as comprehension, understanding goes. So, number 3, in Isaiah chapter 3, verse 4, the city of Matura or Heliopolis is called in the Vulgate Hanes or Hans, and in the LLX Heliopolis. Mr. Brand observes that the place called Hanes is, by Stephanus Byzantinus, called Innes and by Herodotus. Now, it is remarkable that this was the very city to which the Phoenix came at the end of every 600 years to burn itself on the altar of the temple of the sun, but under the circumstance of the Hebrews having no letter which answered to the Coptic or Egyptian, the word by them may have been rendered by the letter. This must also suppose the Egyptian language when the name Phanes was given to the city to be older than the Syrian of the time of Isaiah. But when what I have said and shall say respecting the antiquity of the language of African Ethiopia is considered, this will be found to be of no consequence, as Phoenicia was imagined to have had its name from a hero, Phoenix. So Syria is said to have had its name from a man called Cyrus. Down here in the footnote, he got good footnotes. On this one it says, I have said in my Celtic Druids, he wrote the book Celtic Druids, that Canaanites meant Thruders. I have changed my opinion on this subject. They were traders, no doubt, but they were called from the Hebrew natur, omnium, gentrix, directrix, I don't know. Hence the Khan, or Diana of the Etruscans, and the Giun, or round cakes, in honor of the colorum. Hence the Chan, or the Jana of the ancient Romans, the Chion, became Juno. It was closely connected with the Chaones or Caones, and had the same meaning as the Apollo. Colneus, the sun god of Egypt, is called Kan by Diodorus Siculus, has observed that the lotus is equally sacred to the Khan of Egypt and Kania of India. In Deuteronomy, Moses orders the Israelites to destroy the names of the divinities of the land. Solomon Jarchi says this was done by giving them a contemptible name. This was the origin of Babylon, city of confusion. In the same way, and for the same reason probably, Canaan was a sectarian name of reproach with the Jews. In Greece, signified Mount Olympus or heaven, and any place abominated or unholy. Hence Babylon, perhaps, the great disorder in ancient history has arisen, in some measure, from the custom of calling princes by new names and titles of honor. This is carried to such an extent in the Burman Empire that of the native country shudders at the idea of calling his prince by his proper name. Nothing can be more clear than that this, or something very similar to it and equally embarrassing to the historian, was practiced in the East in ancient times. We find Abraham, Jacob, Joshua, and many others changed their names, and in these cases the text of the history tells us why, or at least when they changed them. But what should we have done if we had not had that information? So we'll continue on in the normal part of the book. One of the earthborn people, but Mr. Bryan says, Sir, Saur, whence was formed, signified the sun. It was the same as Sihor of Egypt, called by the Greeks. The city of Ur in Chaldea was sometimes called Sur, and Synceles says Abraham was born in the city Sur. Stephanus says Sur was common to many places. From this it seems that Abraham may have come from an oriental Sur or Soria. But Abraham, or the Brahmin, came from Ur of the Chaldees. This may have been the peninsula of Saurashta, or of Zoroaster, or Surastan, which has been supposed to mean the fire of the Chaldees, alluding to their fire worship. Fire worship, however, was not objected to by Moses, but was continued by him as much as by other nations, for it was adopted by no nations in their temples except merely as an emblem of a superior being. We have seen just now that Abraham was said by some authors to have come from a place called Sur as well as Ur, and Sur meant beeve or bull. All this is consistent, for Sur was called from the bull, in the old language being the origin of the word Urus, or bive, or beve, bive. After what has been said respecting the identity of the ancient languages of Italy and India, I feel no hesitation in locating Latin words in India, and thus I am led to the conclusion that Abraham's family must have come away from his country to avoid the adoration of the bull as well as that of the Yoni. We have found the Agnes or Aries in the Yagna sacrifice, the Agni construed to mean fire, the Agnes lamb overlooked. In the same manner we find the word called fire, the meaning of Urus or bull being overlooked. The circumstance of the Agni being only known at this time to mean fire is a proof that the Sanskrit language has been changed, and that we ought to go to an older language, its parent, or rather to it before its change. No one, I think, who looks at the word Agni and considers that in the Yagna sacrifice, or the sacrifice of the Agni, a lamb is slain, and that the Agni always rides a lamb, or if on foot, carries a standard bearing a lamb, and the other circumstance pointed out by me, can doubt that the word Agni has originally meant lamb. I do not think that the least appearance of the worship of the bull can ever be perceived in the tribe of Abraham until their return from Egypt, but the sacrifice of the ram is ordained by God in lieu of the human sacrifice of Isaac. There was a district in India called or Uri or Oriana on the Jumna, which we shall find was the place from which Abraham came. 4. Abraham and his family or clan probably left their country on account of what he truly considered the corruption of the religion. The reconciliation or the coalition which the Brahmin books say took place between the followers of the Linga and those of the Aoni. He seems to have been of the sect of the Linga alone. When he first came into Canaan, the natives with their Canaanitish king priest Melchizedek were of his religion, that of Brahma and Persia. When his tribe returned from Egypt under the command of Joshua or the Savior, to which only they had been driven by famine, and where it is evident that they never were comfortable, they found the Canaanites with their Ionic cities, Iona at Antioch and Iona at Gaza, had become corrupted. They had fallen into hearsay of Babylon and the Chaldees. The measure of their iniquity was full, and they conquered them. The Canaanites forfeited their dominions, and the Israelites seized them, and under the Savior, the son of Naveh, restored the temple of Melchizedek on Gerizim, which was afterward removed by David and Soleiman, or Solomon, to Jerusalem. This shows us why the Israelites were a peculiar people in the midst of nations of enemies on every side, hating all nations except the Persians, who, in the time of Cyrus and Ahasuerus, were of their own religion, and who, without minding their domestic feud, restored their temples both on Gerizim and at Jerusalem. The Israelites exhibit several remarkable points of resemblance to the followers of Brahma and Krishna to this day. The religions are mutually intermixed with many of the rites and ceremonies of their predecessors, the Buddhists. The first book of Genesis is Buddhist. The sacrifice of the lamb at the vernal equinox or at the Passover is clearly the sacrifice of the Yajna, offered by the followers of Krishna and Brahma. This accounts for the hatred of Moses to the bull and the partiality to the lamb. Jeroboam and the Samaritans fell off to the bull and the queen of heaven into the union, and thus, too, the Iudahites became heretics. I have said above that Abraham came from India or Persia. It is very possible that the tribe might originally have come from India and have resided a long time in Persia before it moved forwards into Canaan. Now, look at this anyways. Look at what he already saying, Abraham come from India. So he's already on point with it, but not all the way. And okay, we gonna get to volume 2, don't trip. It is very possible that great numbers of persons constituted the tribe and came into Syria, and went then into Egypt. Through the history of the family of Abraham only is given. I think this is not contrary to the fair meaning of the history and removes some difficulties. Although the ancients of the West do not seem to have known much of the doctrines or sacred books of the Jews, yet Abraham was well known to them. Several persons, both Greek and Oriental, have written respecting him. They all agree that he was not a native of Syria, but that he came thither from the east. If we can believe Mr. Faber, how far east are we talking about, baby? If we can believe Mr. Faber in the Decipher, which must, I think, be genuine, however, much of it may have been corrupted by Moshani in rendering it out of the old language into Persian. The adoration of the bull and Buddhism first prevailed in Persia, but this there is reason to believe was succeeded by Krishna and the Lamb, which might have come in with Gemshid. The ancients would say that from Brahma, who came into Persia, came Brahmanism and the Brahmins, but yet there would have been no Brahma. Thus, when the Israelite tribe, who were a sect of Brahmins, came into Syria, they would merely say that Abram, came. The whole history of Abram or Abraham, that is, Abram, has a most mythological appearance. The reason given for changing his name in Genesis is very unsatisfactory, and I am induced to think that it looks very like the reason of a person writing and not understanding the meaning of the name, or, which is still more likely, not choosing to give the meaning of it, under the change of which some mystery was probably concealed. The word means multitude, and the word Ab may mean father, but Abr never means father. Now suppose the letter A, after the manner of the Chaldee, to be the emphatic, to mean the, and the word Brum to mean the same as the Brahmin of India, whatever that might be, and suppose this Br, the first syllable of the Maya, to mean, as Mr. Wider says it does, mean in all old languages, creator or former, giver of forms. Then, by adding it to the word we get the meaning given by the author of Genesis, and this in a way in perfect keeping with the remainder of the book, though perhaps mystical enough. I again repeat that according to the common idiom of the Hebrew, Abraham cannot mean father of a multitude. Dr. Hale says that Abram meant a high father, and Abraham a father of a multitude of nations, from Ab, a father, in Chaldee, great, and the abridgment of Emun, multitude. It has been thought that the word Abraham had the meaning of stranger. This will apply to the Brahmins as well as to Abraham, because they are considered to have come into India from the north. The reader must remember that I am supposing Moses to have written many hundred years after the arrival of the tribe from the east, and that in the course of the events of which I treat, time enough had passed for the languages to have materially changed, an event which we know to have taken place. Then I think there is nothing against our going back to a language common to both for the origin of the word, for the farther back we go, the nearer, of course, all the language would be to one another. Let me not be called a wicked atheist for seeing the likeness between Brahma and Abraham. For what says the Reverend and learned Joseph Hager? Quote, as the Indian alphabets are all syllabic, and every consonant without a vowel annexed is understood to have an A joined to it, there is no wonder if from Abraham was made Brahma. And thus we see other Persian words in the Sanskrit having an A annexed, as Diva from Dev, Appa from Ab, Duda from Dud, etc. Unquote. Dr. Hyde says that Ibrahim, or Abraham, by the Persians is never called otherwise than Ibrahim, or Abraham, Zaradusht. That is evidently Zaradusht, the Brahmin. All this, I think, is confirmed by a fact which we learn from Damascenus, that Abraham first reigned at Damascus, and Alexander Polyester, who lived about 90 years before Christ, and Eupolemus, who lived about 250 years before Christ, say that he came and resided in Egypt at Heliopolis, that is, Maturia, and there taught astrology, which he did not profess to have invented, but to have learnt from his ancestors, of course, in the East. This is confirmed by Artapanus. It seems not unreasonable to suppose that by means of Abraham, Maturia acquired its Indian name, the name of the birthplace of Krishna. Number 5. Mr. Bryan thinks that Abaris in Egypt had its name from the word Ober. This seems not unlikely, as it was here that the Israelites dwelt. It does not seem improbable that it had its name from them, as I have shown in my Celtic Druids, that they had their name from the word Ober. The city of, quote, the city of Obaris was called Setrom, and Urbs, Typhonia, Seth being, as Plutarch assures us, the Egyptian name of Typhon, the great enemy of their gods, unquote. It seems to me to be difficult to say that Abaris was not the city of Maturia of Abaris, or Obri, the strangers, of Heliopolis, of On, or of Destruction, as it was called, or Typhon. The names of this city curiously confirm my doctrines. It was called On, or the city of the generative power of the sun. It was also called the city of Typhon, or of destruction, because destruction was regeneration. It was also the city of the sun, because the sun was both creator and destroyer. The sacred books tell us why Abraham went into Egypt, and the Gentile authors find him there, and thus confirm the fact, and the finding this Brahmin and his tribe at Maturia is very striking. All this is confirmed in various ways by Eupolemus, Berosus, Philo, and Josephus, and indirectly also, I think I may say, by Sanchoniathon. When Alexander says that Heliopolitan priests made use of the astrology of Abraham, it is the same as to say the astrology of the Brahmins. And when the Greek Orpheus says that God of old revealed himself to one Chaldean only, I quite agree with Hornius that it is probable the person called Abraham is meant. Whether he was really a person or a sect or a system, I beg leave to observe in passant that from Sanchoniathon we have in substance the same cosmogony for the Phoenicians as is found in Genesis. On this account, the genuineness of his work has been doubted, but I think without sufficient reason, as the reader must perceive. Josephus and Plutarch think that the Phoenician shepherds said to be driven out of Egypt were the Israelites, but what Bishop Cumberland has written upon Sanchoniathon's account has nearly satisfied me that these people must have been expelled more than 300 years before. The circumstance of these Phoenicians being able to conquer and hold possession of Egypt shows that Phoenicia, and I suppose of course its capital Sidon, must have been a very great and powerful state before the time of Abraham. I think these shepherds must have been at Pali, or Philistines, have been the Pali, or Philistines, who came from the border of the Erythraean Sea, and at the first from the peninsula of Saurastrene, or Sarastra, which perhaps mean the country of Zoroaster. Number 6. I will now state another fact, which, coming from the quarter whence we have it, cannot be disputed on account of any interest or system. The tribe of Krishna had a name, noticed by me before the book 5, which is very remarkable. Captain Wilford says, quote, the Yadus, his own tribe and nation, were doomed to destruction for their sins, like the descendants of Yahuda, or Yuda, which is the true pronunciation of Judah. They all fell, in general, by mutual wounds, a few excepted, who led through Ayambudwipa, a miserable and wretched life. There are some to be found in Gujarat, but they are represented as poor and wretched, unquote. Mr. Marie says, quote, the Yadavas were the most venerable immigrants from India. They were the blameless and pious Ethiopians, whom Homer mentions and calls the remotest of mankind. Part of them, say the old Hindu writers, remained in this country, and hence we read of 2 Ethiopian nations, the Western and the Oriental. Some of them lived far to the east, and they are the Yadavas, who stayed in India, while others resided far to the west, unquote. The fact of part of the tribe yet remaining in existence is one of the pieces of circumstantial evidence which I consider invaluable. I cannot be the produce of forgery, and couples very well with the 2 Sions, 2 Marus, etc., etc. It is on circumstances of this kind that I ground my system. They surpass all written evidence, for they cannot have been forged. This immigrating tribe of Yadu, or Yuda, we shall find of the first importance, for they were no other than the Jews. Porphyry, in his book called, quoted by Eusebius, makes Saturn to be called Israel. His words are these. Then he adds that the same Saturn had by a nymph called an only son, whom for this day they called Aud, as he is so called to this day by the Phoenicians. This only son, he adds, was sacrificed by his father. Both charts says, quote, thus Aud amongst the Hebrews is Ahid, which is the epithet given to Isaac, concerning whom it is evident that Porphyry writes. Bochart is followed by Stillingfleet, who says, quote, Abraham is here called by the name of his posterity, Israel, Isaac, Jehud. Take thy son, Ahid, is the same with the Phoenician Jod, unquote. This is again confirmed by Vossius. There is, I think, no difficulty in finding here the Audai, or tribe of Judah, of the Hindus, long before the Jews of western Syria could have taken that name from one of the sons of Jacob, called Judah, a name which cannot have been first derived from him, because it is clear that they had an epithet long before he was born, his grandfather Isaac having borne it. Stillingfleet and Bocart observe that Hemobrut, meaning conceiving by grace, respecting the Onobret of Sanchoniathon, Valiancy, has given a copy of his very extraordinary Irish manuscript with a translation of it, in which an Irish king's wife is said to bring forth a white lamb, whence she was called Una Bret, i.e., bringing forth the white lamb. This distressed her very much, but she again conceived and brought forth a son, when she was told by the priest that her womb was consecrated, and the lamb must be sacrificed as her firstborn for her, or purification of her firstborn. I quite agree with Valiancy that this can be no monkish forgery of the 11th century. I think it decidedly proves, first, that the Irish did really come from Phoenicia, and secondly, that Sanchoniathon is not a forgery. But the proper meaning of Sion Nauda is evidently not what Valiancy gives us for the purification of the firstborn, but for the salvation of Judah of Sion. The whole story is exceedingly curious. The son she brought forth was called Eod Slane, i.e., because he was saved from the sacrifice. I think Eod Slane is the same as though it is so much corrupted as scarcely to be discoverable. See how much they have. He might be having to reach right here, because see, in volume 1 he's still so confused. He has no clue of what's about to pop off with Lord Kingsborough. That the history of the sacrifice is that of, but he's still on to something. That's the whole point, is that he not taking. That's why all this is wrote. This is a huge book. And that's why he's writing all this, because he knows it's a deeper than what is just presented. There's veils to be removed here. So let me see. That the history of the sacrifice is of the nature of a mythos, or fable, or parable, for the purpose of teaching a doctrine is, I think, very clear, and I think the doctrine also is clear. The first object was to abolish human sacrifices by the substitution of the lamb, which Moses afterward did better by a redemption price. The next object was to inculcate the absolute necessity of obeying without any, even the slightest, doubt or hesitation, the orders of God, in other words, the order of the priest. That we should find the name of Audai of the sect in the father of the 12 tribes is not surprising, and accords well with what I have suggested. The word Jew is a mere Anglicism, and the word Yudi or Ayudi is more correctly the Hindu name, come from where it would. No doubt it might come from the name of a son of Jacob, but still this must have been a second hand after the division of the tribes. It is most probable that it came from the tribe of Iudia, as the head of the tribe seems to have been known by that name, as I have before stated, many years before the son of Jacob was born, and who was probably so called after his ancestor. When Porphyry called Isaac by the epithet Iud, he perhaps meant Isaac the Iudite, or Isaac of the tribe of Iud or Judah, the name given to Jacob, Israel, or Israel. Notwithstanding, Crudin's attempt to explain it by improperly changing one of the letters is evidently unknown. Isr Iser, Iser is the name of the book of Jasher, which has been construed the correct book. As this word gives name to the whole tribe, it is a very important and desirable thing to ascertain its meaning. I expect it will be discoverable in the East, but perhaps it may only mean the same as Isron, an upright person. Then it might be the great upright one. Bouchard, Gale, and many other of our learned men think the Phoenicians derived their letters, learning, etc. from the Jews. This is easily explained. When the Israelitish tribe arrived in Canaan, they found the natives professing the religion in all its first principles, meaning that it was still of original origin. Nothing had come in and tainted it. Okay? So when the Israelitish tribe arrived in Canaan, they found the natives professing their religion in all of its originality. Okay? First principles. It might be of the Indian religion before the division about the Linga and Yoni took place, or when it partook of both, or before the division had traveled so far westwards. From where? Okay. However this might be, the name of Iona bore by the towns of Gaza and Antioch pretty well shows that it became, if not entirely, yet in great measure, Ionian afterward. This easily accounts for the idea of Gale and Bouchard, to which, without it, there would be opposed the striking fact that we scarcely know of the Phoenicians from the Jews except as their enemies, and this makes greatly against the Phoenicians having borrowed their learning from them. People are not often willing to learn of their enemies. Abraham is said by Oriental historians to have brought the knowledge of astronomy to the Canaanites and Egyptians. It may have been the astronomy of the Brahmins which he brought. It is not unlikely that though the Egyptians and Phoenicians may have had much knowledge before Abraham or his sector tribe arrived, he may have brought them in an increase, and this would be quite enough to authorize his successors to say and to believe that he was their first instructor. And this theory accounts for the similarity between the writings of Sanchoniathon and the book of Genesis. Now, Porphyry says, quote, the Sanchoniathon and Moses gave the like account of persons and places, and that Sanchoniathon extracted his account partly out of the annals of the cities and partly out of the book reserved in the temple, which he received from Jerombalus, priest of the god Jehovah, i.e. Jau, or Jehovah, or Yao, or Jehovah. The words of, unquote, the words of Porphyry are, as given by Eusebius. All this shows that fundamental doctrines of the tribe of Abraham and the Phoenicians were the same, though they themselves might be of different sects. This system established by Moses confirmed the line of separation between them. His anxiety was to prevent his people from falling into the Tauric or Ionian heresy and heresy of Babylon and Iona, ancient Antioch, and of Iona, of the Philistines of Gaza, his bitter enemies, to prevent them from relapsing into the worship of the bull-headed Baal and Baltis and the bull-eyed Juno, or Astaroth, the Queen of Heaven. He endeavored to keep them to the religion professed by Melchizedek, to the worship which Abraham brought, and which his tribe followed at Maturia or Heliopolis of Egypt, to the worship of the Savior or Messiah, typified by the Lamb of the Zodiac in India, called the Savior or Hare Krishna, in short, to the worship of the male generative principle. We have seen that the Yaru was said in India to be the father of Krishna, and what they mean by that is, when we're going over some of the things that we're going through with the investigations with the team, the aspect of how we have the male androgynous deities of understanding here in America and how they are being translated over to India and brought to other societies, and then we have a split of those two, and this is clearly being spoken about as it's possibly at a later period than the Americas, as far as what we've seen so far, at least what we coming across. So number 7, it has often appeared to me an extraordinary circumstance that the God of Moses should be called by the same names as the God of the Gentiles, Adonis and Baal, for instance. I have read that the Jews count in the Bible 32 names of gods, but I believe in no case whatever will he be found by the name of one of their goddesses, though he is called Baal He is not called Baltis. If I be right, this is easily accounted for. When Abraham arrived in Canaan, the Ionian heresy did not prevail, and he had no objection to his God being called after the names of the gods of the single male principle, or perhaps of the double principle. But he utterly rejected the Ionism and the idolatry, its general concomitant, into which Canaan and Syria fell, between the time of his tribe going into Egypt and returning, as the Hebrew text says, after upwards of 400 years. When the tribe left Canaan, the Ionic principle might be gaining ground, but not have become the prevailing superstition. When the Jews returned, increased in strength and sword in hand, the name of the towns Iona show that Ionism prevailed. As I have stated before, the close similarity between paganism and Judaism is not only admitted by Mr. Faber, but is descanted on him at great length. And after showing the absolute insufficiency of all theories he had promulgated to account for it, he says, quote, Judaism and paganism sprang from a common source, hence their close resemblance in many particulars is nothing more than might have been reasonably anticipated, unquote. If it be said that we do not find such clear marks of this resemblance in the books of the Jews as we ought to do, I reply, we everywhere find the worship of the female generative power reprobated under the name of Astaroth of the Sidonians, Queen of Heaven, Bolishmin, and Muktisman, and the male Jove or Jupiter extolled. If I be right, it is evidently the object of the Israelitish books to conceal the secret doctrine under an allegorical history. Let's say that one more time. If I be right, it is evidently the object of the Israelitish books to conceal the secret doctrine under an allegorical history. And it is very possible that the real truth might be soon forgotten by the Jews who contemplated their histories with only the narrow views and eyes of sectaries. In the whole of the Jewish books, I cannot discover a single passage indicative of a tendency to tolerate the worship of a Queen of Heaven. If ever anything like an attempt was made, as in the case of Solomon, it was met with the bitterest intolerance on the part of the priests. Witness their violence against him for his toleration of the Sidonians. Not his adoption of the religion, I believe, but only his toleration of it. With respect to the adoration of the female generative principle, the Israelites and the neighboring Gentiles seem to have been situated exactly like the Baptists and the Protestants. The Israelites adorned the phallus, or linga, as is evident from the stone set up and anointed with oil by Jacob. But nowhere can an emblem of the female principle be discovered. The festival of the So see, what's important here is the aspect that the further we go back into understanding the religions, they looked at the divine as multifaceted. And especially here in America, we can see the clear trail that's left in the split of the two, of the male and female principles. Continuing on. The festival of the ram, the yajna, sacrifice, the emblem of the I am that I am, or the I will be what I have been, and the masculine gender is apparent in the variety of ways, but nowhere can any emblem of the female principle be discovered except as an object of reprobation. The Gentiles adorned both, examples of which need not be given. The modern Romanists adore the ram, the Lamb of God, and also the Virgin, the Mother of God, the Queen of Heaven, the Regina Stellarum. The Protestants adore the Lamb of God, but they, like the Israelites, can scarcely be found in any case to pay the least respect to the Queen of Heaven. At Antioch, Iona, at Delphi, at Rome, both are adored. At Jerusalem and London, only one, the Lamb, the Ioni, was and is detested in the last named places. The fact cannot be denied. Was it the effect of an accident or of a secret religion? Probably the same some cause arising from the character of man in certain classes, which produced the dislike to Ionism, or the adoration of the female anciently in India, produced the same in our Calvins and Luthers, of the real nature of which they might be themselves unconscious. It will perhaps be objected to this, that there is no more particular account of the distinction in the Scriptures, but the case in this respect is exactly the same as it would be with us if all the writings of our time were lost except the sacred ones, as were those of the Israelites. But the worship of the Queen of Heaven is reprobated many times by the prophets, particularly by Jeremiah, and that in the strongest terms. My reader must recollect that, according to the Hindu history of the religion, the first worship was paid to a double object, like I said, and that the worshippers were afterward divided into those who adored the male and those who adorned the female principle. It is notorious that there are in India great numbers of sects divided from each other, like the sects of the Christians, sometimes by important and other times by trifling and perfectly unimportant distinctions. With this well-known fact before them, it is perfectly astonishing that our Indian philosophers should expect to find the different astronomical and astrological mythos explained by one key. There are probably great numbers of systems, all having perhaps the same kind of foundation but differing in the superstructure. The system of the 10 ages, which I have explained, is one. The system of the 14 manvantaras is another. Number 8. I have been told in reply to my arguments in favor of Abraham and his tribe of Ayudai, being Brahmins, that if it were so, we should find the metempsychosis in Judaism. I am ready to acknowledge that this seems a fair objection. Oh, y'all gotta remember that this is so important when we come into volume 2, okay? The metempsychosis, alright? But this tenet may have constituted part of the esoteric doctrine as alleged by Mr. Maurice, and as some other equally important doctrines appear to have done. For instance, the immortality of the soul is so little apparent in the Pentateuch that many of the most learned Christian divines have denied that it is there at all. A great bishop was written 12 volumes to prove it is not there. And I reply that whatever caused the concealment of the one caused the concealment of the other, or whatever caused the one to be little apparent caused the other to be little apparent. They are, in their nature, closely allied. The most learned of the old Jewish rabbis and the first and most learned fathers of the church, I suppose, thought that they could see them in the Bible as they maintained both doctrines, which they would scarcely have done unless they had thought they had authority for their opinion. Learned Christian divines have found no small difficulty in the fact just named, that in the Pentateuch there is not the least appearance of the doctrine of a future life or of a place of punishment after death. The cause of this is to be found in the circumstance that the Jews secretly held the doctrine of the metempsychosis and the perpetual renewal of worlds, doctrines thought to be too sublime for the vulgar comprehension. You hear that? You hear that? Let's go over that one more time. Learned Christian divines have found no small difficulty in the fact just named, that in the Pentateuch there is not the least appearance of a doctrine of a future life, or of a place of punishment after death. The cause of this is to be found in the circumstance that the Jews secretly held the doctrine of the metempsychosis and the perpetual renewal of worlds, doctrines thought to be too sublime for vulgar comprehension. The doctrine of a Hades or hell arose in times long after those of Moses among the Persians, when the doctrine of the two principles came to be formed and the sublime Hindu Trimurti was forgotten. It is evident that the doctrine of a hell is quite inconsistent with the metempsychosis. This simple consideration removes all Bishop Warburton's difficulties. At first, when Christianity was unsettled, the transmitigation of souls and the millennium or renewal of worlds were received by the Christian fathers. But as the more modern doctrine of two principles, good and evil, gained ground, the other declined and was forgotten. The two doctrines were totally incompatible. The failure of the prophecies of the millennium greatly aided in producing this effect, but all of this I shall treat hereafter. At first, the Gnostic and Manichaean doctrines, which possessed much sublimity, were, with a very trifling exception, universal. At that time, mankind retrograded rapidly, and as they became degraded, the degrading doctrines of the Greek and Latin sectaries prevailed, till the world was overrun with thaumaturgists and devil drivers, and all the absurdities which Protestantism has unveiled. Number 9. The likeness between Abraham and Brahma and between their wives in histories was observed by Dr. Hyde. Indeed, it is so marked that to miss observing it is impossible. Of course, he supposes that all the immense fabric of Hindu superstition was derived from the man, Abraham. In palliation of this absurdity, it must be recollected that in the time of Hyde, the nature of the Hindu history and religion was not at all known. But seeing the striking similarity between the doctrines of the Hindus and those of the Christians and Jews, he pronounces that Brahma was Abraham. Postellus, in Commentario ad Jazera, had long before asserted the same thing, and that the Brahmins were the descendants of the patriarch by his wife Ketura, and were so called quasi-Abrahamanes. This doctrine is supported by the Arabian historians who contend that Brahma and Abraham, their ancestor, are the same person. Dr. Hyde in Prideaux, receiving the likeness between the Persians and Jews, supposed Zoroaster to have been of the Jewish religion. They were certainly so far right that the two nations were of the same religion. I have already observed that the Persians generally call Abraham Ibrahim Zarathustra. Hyde says, Parsarum religio in multis. Hyde, in his first chapter, shows that the ancient Persians had a sacred fire precisely the same as the Jews, from which it did not differ in any respect, and that the reverence to, or adoration of, this fire was exactly the same as that of the Jews to theirs, from which he says the Persians copied it. He quotes Ezra to show that Cyrus considered the religion of the Jews the same as his own. For proofs of the truth of this theory, my reader may refer back to Book 2, Chapter 4. It is admitted that Abraham and Brahma are the same. Therefore, the Hindus must have come from Abraham, or the Israelites of Brahma. Now, Christian reader, look to the Pentateuch, which you cannot dispute, and you will see the whole history of circumcision, and how and why it was first adopted by Abraham for all his descendants. And if the Brahmins had descended from him, they would certainly have had this right. But in no part of India is this right observed by the Brahmins. This at once proves that Abraham came from the Brahmins, if either came from the other. Sir W. Jones, in his translation of the Institutes of Manu, renders the word Brahmana in the sense of priest, and the Jesuit Robert de Nobilibus, in what have been said to be his forged Vedas, calls the high priest of the Jews and his associates Yuda Brahmana, that is, the words being in regimen Brahmin of the holy Hae. I suspect that in mystic words like Yuda, the last syllable meaning ending in D and A vowel always means holy, or has the meaning of the Latin divus. The expression of the Jesuit shows that he considered the word Yuda to be the same as the name of the tribe of Abraham. Mr. Here below, Bibliot Orient article Behavior calls Abraham Geogis, from the word yogis. Our word Jews may probably have come. I beg the reader to pronounce aloud the word Geogis. The Sanskrit word Ayudha becomes the English Ayub, in Javanese Nayubya, and in Dutch, still more barbarously, de Joju. Here we arrive very nearly at the words Jude and Jew, as is apparent on pronouncing the words, and here it is found in the island of Java, the mother or sister of the island of Bali, which contains a place called Madura, the same as Mathura or Mutra of Upper India, where the statue of Bala, Rama, and Krishna so often before noticed is found. The island of Java is the island of Iowa, or Jehovah. Okay, so we're gonna bust down into this chapter 2 real quick, see what's going down in this thing, because it's talking about some black Jews. So like, what? We have, number 1, we have seen the dove is a peculiar manner, the emblem of the Aoni. With this, we find the Jews at almost perpetual war. The Assyrians are constantly described in the Jewish books by the term sword of the oppressor. In several places where we find this, it ought to be rendered the sword of the dove. This was the emblem or crest or coat of arms carried by the followers of the imaginary, or at least mystical Semiramis, who was said to have been born or near the Philistine Iona, or the Semirama Isis of India, of whom I shall presently treat. See Colonel Wilford's essay on Semiramis. Persons may have different opinions as to the cause of the dove, or Kapotaswari, becoming the emblem of the female generative power, as also of the Holy Spirit, the third person of the Trinity, but the fact cannot be disputed. The Chaldeans, or Chazdim, or Chaldees, were priests of the Assyrians and worshippers of the dove, or female generative power, whence they called their sacred isle of the west Iona, or Columba, that is, the female dove, not the male, or Columbus. And remember too, Columba, right? The dove constellation. No person who has studied the Romish hagiographa can doubt of the origin of the bishops Iona and Columba. Number 2, the Reverend Dr. Claudius Buchanan, I believe a missionary, some years ago published travels in India in which he states that he found no less than 65 settlements of black Jews in different parts of the peninsula. It is a great pity that these different races of people could not be examined by a philosopher. Dr. Buchanan, who found the Christians of St. Thomas before they were what he would call corrupted by the Romish Church, to have been and yet be correct Lambeth Christians, notwithstanding that they received the gospel of the infancy and were Nestorians, could not be expected to discover much. These black Jews are remnants of the sect of Iudis, who, Colonel Wilford informs us, yet remained in Gujarat. I apprehend that they were part of a sect of the Linga, who would not unite with, or divided from, the followers of the female principle, the Argha or Ioni, or from those of the double principle, and, on that account, were persecuted and expelled, and from them came the tribe of Abram, or the Brahmin. If this were the case, they would not, of course, have all the Mosaic books in the form in which we have them, except they received them from the West. If this were the case, they would not, of course, have all the Mosaic books in the form in which we have them, except they received them from the West. And this seems rationally to account for the places in Syria being called by names of places in India. We know how almost all immigrants have given the names of countries of their births to their new habitations. Jeremiah Jones says, quote, Mr. La Crosse, in a letter dated at Berlin, the 4th of the Ideas of December 1718 supposes it, i.e. the Gospel of the Infancy, written by some person who was an historian, because in a synod called Diam Parana, held by Alexius de Menezes, Archbishop of Goa, in the Diocese of Augamala, in the mountainous country of Malabar, in the year of Christ 1559, he found it thus condemned. The book, which is titled Of the Infancy of Our Savior, or the History of Our Lady, already condemned by the ancient saints, because it contains many blasphemies and heresies, and many fabulous stories without foundation, etc. Instances of which are produced in that synod, the same as are in Dr. Sykes' Gospel, and it is there said that it was commonly read among the Nestorians in Malabar, unquote. Now we're going to check out this footnote real quick. Okay, so it says that of Brennus the Celt, our barbarian ancestor, was accompanied by a circumstance which appears trifling, but which exhibits a proof of the great antiquity of our practice of bearing devices or coats of arms. Nimrod, Volume 1, page 178, says, quote, the confusion fell upon the army at the closing in of the evening, and at first a few only were confounded in mind, who imagined they heard the tramp of horses and the onset of some enemy, and in a little time this alienation possessed the minds of them all, and taking up arms and dividing among themselves, they mutually destroyed one another, no longer understanding their own native tongue, nor yet recognizing the countenances of each other, nor the devices on their shields. Continuing on, from an observation which Mr. Jones has made respecting the Marcosians, a branch of the Gnostics, and respecting a passage of Irenaeus already noticed, I think it is unquestionable that the gospel of the infancy existed in the 2nd century. There is also existing part of a gospel called the Gospel of Thomas, which is evidently taken from the same source as that of the infancy, and St. Thomas is said to have instructed the Indians. The extract from Jones shows that if what Buchanan says be true, that the opinions of the Malabar Christians are the same as the present English Protestants, they must have surprisingly changed since the arrival among them of the Portuguese. It seems remarkable that the Portuguese Baptists should have converted these Nestorians into Protestants. It is, to me, utterly incredible that any tribe of people existing as a tribe should exist as Mosaic Jews without the Pentateuch, because the Pentateuch forms their bond of union. It is not only their religious, but it is their civil code, which regulates the decisions of their judges in disputes about the common affairs of life. If they ever were Jews, they must once have possessed the Pentateuch, and they must have lost it, which seems incredible, when it must always have been in the daily use by the judges. I believe the case to be this, that they were tribes of Yahudi or Yadu, which were spared when opposing sects got the better of them in the wars of the Mahabharata, and were left in a poor and miserable state without books or literature, spared, in fact, from mere contempt, being too low to excite fear or anger, that in the course of many generations their origin was forgotten. In meeting with Jews from the West and comparing notes, they found a near relationship and accounted for it by supposing that they must have come from Western Syria, in consequence of the revolutions which had taken place there. Their real history, in 2,000 years and upwards, might well be forgotten. The ancient, and you know what's so funny about that? Is that's literally what has happened here with so-called African Americans here in America. Like, straight up, 100%, like, to the T. You think if he was writing this in 1836, that some governmental agency or group of people got together and said that this was the ultimate plan as well and made it work? I mean, come on, wouldn't you do that to gain all power and control? The ancient civil religious wars of India are recorded in the books of the Brahmins, but they are totally forgotten among the masses of the people. From the accounts given by Dr. Buchanan of the black tribes, some of them having Pentateuchs and others not having them, and of those who have them having obtained them from the white tribes, it seems probable that they are indebted for them solely to the white tribes. Dodge the hijack, watch out now. This will exactly agree, as might be expected, with my theory, if it should turn out to be true, because going out of the tribe of Judai, or Ayudai, from India, in all probability, Hayudi, must have taken place before Moses lived and before he partly wrote and partly compiled or collected the tracts into what we now call the Pentateuch. In all probability, the first books of Genesis were brought from India with the tribe, with Abraham, or the Brahmin. The more I meditate on the extraordinary fact stated by Buchanan that there are many black tribes of what are called in our language Jews, but evidently tribes of Ayudi, in different parts of India, who have not the Pentateuch of Moses, the more extraordinary and important it appears. The Pentateuch is the civil law of the Jews, but what law do these tribes govern themselves? It is by tradition. If they be Jews, they must be descendants of Jacob or Abraham, which branched off before the law was given. You hear that? And if their law be very well similar to that of the present Ayudi, it will prove, what indeed seems pretty clear without it, that Moses adopted in his written law many of the old laws which his tribe had before. Eusebius in his Chronicon says that Ethiopians coming from the Indus or Black River settled near Egypt. There seems to be nothing improbable in these Ethiopians being the tribe of Jews, the tribe of Jacob or Israel. I think these Ethiopians did come under Jacob and did settle in Goshen and gave the names of Maturia and Avaris to the city in which they dwelt. Avari in Hebrew would be as often written Obri, or the city of the Hebrews or foreigners. The city of the Hebrews or foreigners. They not from there. It's not where they originate. Even though we talking about some good stuff with the Ethiopians, they still foreigners. It can scarcely be maintained that the places in Egypt which have names connected with the word Judah can have been called in that early day from that tribe of the Jews. But if it be, I then ask how the name Solomon, which is found in the desert of Salome, etc., is to be accounted for. Taken together, the two exhibit the general Judean mythos, independently of the tribe of Jacob or Israel. Eusebius's assertion in his Chronicon by Scaliger that about the year BC 1575 a tribe of Ethiopians came from the river Indus and encamped and settled in Egypt is but a loose kind of information and therefore can be little depended on, but as he fixes them to about the time when the Jews are generally supposed to have come, it rather tends to confirm my idea, though I pay little attention to the dates, knowing that chronology's messed up. It is not impossible that without knowing it, he may allude to the Jewish tribe. But if this evidence be only weak, I will now produce what will not be easily overthrown. Number 3. Megasthenes, who was sent to India by Seleucus Nicator about 300 years before Christ, and whose accounts from new inquiries are every day acquiring additional credit in a very remarkable manner, confirms my hypothesis of the Jews coming from India. He says that they were an Indian tribe or sect called Galani, and that their theology was a great resemblance to that of the Indians. The discovery of this passage, after having written what the reader has read respecting the Jews, gave me no little pleasure, because it almost proves the truth of my theory and is very different from founding my theory upon it. I will now produce another proof. If records by unwilling witness are proofs, for Josephus is an unwilling witness. Aristotle gave an account of the Jews that they came from the Indian philosophers, and that they were called by the Indians Galami, and by the Syrians Judei. I think few persons will doubt that the Galamai here are the Galani of Megasthenes, one of the two being miscalled. We have seen a Kalani in Salon, where we found a Zion, Adam's Foot, Mount Ararat, and Colombo, etc., and in Genesis and Amos, a Galne or Galani is also named. Gale has observed that the information of Megasthenes is confirmed by Clearchus, the Peripatetic. I think in this question these Grecian authorities constitute good evidence. Thus, for my hypothesis, we have a good written evidence as can be expected. We will presently try to confirm it by circumstances. Respecting Megasthenes, Colonel Wilford says, quote, Megasthenes, a man of no ordinary abilities who had spent the greatest part of his life in India and a public character as well, and was well acquainted with the chronological systems of the Egyptians, Chaldeans, and Jews, made particular inquiries into their history and declared, according to Clement of Alexandria, that the Hindus and Jews were the only people who had the true idea of the creation of the world and the beginning of things. From these circumstances, Colonel Wilford draws the conclusion that there was an obvious affinity between the chronological systems of the Hindus and the Jews, and they have an obvious tendency to support my theory of the origin of the Jewish tribe. In the formal part of this work, I have noticed an assertion of Megasthenes that the Jews and Indians were the only people who had a true notion of chronology, and have almost most clearly proved that what he said was true, or at least that their chronologies were the same. If I had desired to invent a piece of information in confirmation of what I had said respecting the immigration of the Israelitish tribe from India to Syria, I could not have had anything better than the following passage from Colonel Wilford. The Zohar Manasseh, which the reader will find named, cannot, in this case, be disputed as evidence of the ancient, probably the secret or esoteric opinion of the Jews. The 7 earths, one above another, is a circumstance so totally inapplicable to Jerusalem and so clearly Hindu that the identity of the two cannot be mistaken. Wilford says, quote, Meru, with its 3 peaks on the summit and its 7 steps, includes and encompasses really the whole world, according to the notions of the Hindus and other nations, previously to their being acquainted with the globular shape of the earth. I mentioned in the first part of the Jews were acquainted with the 7 stages, zones, or dvipas of the Hindus. But I have since discovered a curious passage from the Zohar Manasseh on the creation as cited by Basnage in his History of the Jews. There are, says the author, 7 earths, whereof one is higher than the other. For Judea is situated upon the highest earth, and Jerusalem upon the highest mountain of Judea. This is the hill of God, so often mentioned in the Old Testament, the mount of the congregation where the mighty king sits in the sides of the north, according to Isaiah. And there is the city of our God. The Meru of the Hindus has the name of Sabha, or the congregation, and the gods are seated upon it in the sides of the north. There is the holy city of Brahmapuri, where resides Brahma with his court, in the most pure and holy land of Ilavrata. The Judea, or Ayudhya, and Jerusalem named above are evidently compared to the North Pole and Mount Meru. The North Pole and Mount Meru. The North Pole and Mount Meru, which is thus called the place of Audi. We shall presently find that the Arabians, the pole star, was called the Star of Audi. The following passages from the Bible are very striking. Now check this out. That pole star don't ever move. Look it up. It's called Polaris. We talked about that. Beautiful for a situation. The joy of the whole earth is Mount Zion, and this is coming from the Bible. Is Mount Zion on the sides of the north, the city of the great King. The mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established in the top of the mountains. Then Solomon began to build the house of the Lord at Jerusalem in Mount Moriah, where the Lord appeared unto David his father. For thou hast said in thine heart, I will ascend into heaven, I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will sit also upon the mount of the congregation in the sides of the north. I will dwell in the midst of Jerusalem, and Jerusalem shall be called a city of truth, and the mountain of the Lord of hosts, the holy mountain. When we consider that our Bible is merely the sacred writings of the temple upon this mountain of Sion, or Moriah, or Maru, the exaggeration above is only what we might expect to find in them. Thus, the Indians say that the same of their Meru. I think it probable that all these mounts were imitative of the heavenly Jerusalem, described in the last 2 chapters of the very ancient work called Apocalypse. I think if my reader will look back to the preceding pages, he will number 4. He will now observe several circumstances, particularly respecting the Ptolemy, which will tend strongly to confirm an opinion to which I have come after the most patient investigation, that the Israelites were one of the tribes which immigrated from the country of the Afghans, or Rajputs, that is, from the east, to avoid persecution. This is, indeed, in substance the account given by Moses. They were, in fact, a sect which worshipped the male generative principle in opposition to the female. The circumstances relating to the city of Jerusalem and the Ptolemy will be found to be very striking, and will show clearly why we meet with a Mount Sion in India, and with another in Syria. But though I think attachment to the adoration of the male principle, or at least the double principle, in opposition to the female singly, or to Ionism or Hellenism, was one reason for their immigration, I also think it probable that dislike to the adoration of the bull was another. So, if Solomon of Syria, the wise, were a Buddha, one of the 14 Ptolemy, or 14 Manus, or 14 Mahabhads, all supposed to be incarnations of divine wisdom, we see why he was so celebrated for that virtue. He was the son of the shepherd, Dud, who was the son of Asi, who was the son of Aub. I think Dud was a corruption of Yud, as Iachus became Bacchus, Ionius, Dionys, Zeus, Deus, Zankl, Dankel, or Dankl, Zankle. Isi is the male, Isis of India. Aub is Sarasi, Obad, or Abad, i.e. the Buddha. The Persians had a title, Salaman, equivalent to the Greek, and implying universal cosmocrator. And Thamurath aspired to this rank, but the divine Argeng, in whose gallery were the statues of the 72 Salimans, contended with him for the supremacy. This Argeng was the head of the League of and the number 72 is that of the kings subject to the King of Kings. This seems like right here, this whole passage might be like some secret society shit too as well. Like, I ain't gotta highlight it, but it does. The history of Solomon bears a very mythological appearance, which is much confirmed by a passage in Strabo, who asserts that both Syria and Phoenicia had their names from India. He says, speaking from the eruption of the Greeks of the Seleucidae into India, these same Greeks subjugated the country as far as the territory of Siri and Phani. Phani? What? What is that? Causbon supposed the Phanin of Strabo to mean Phoenicum, and so corrected. What? Nah, Phanin? Canaan? Canaan? I don't know. This shows that there were nations of these names in India, which could not be very far from the peninsula of Sarastreni or Sarastrene, or perhaps Rajaputana or Afghanistan. The word Rajaputana, I think, is Rajaputana, or three words which mean the country of the royal Buddha, Paut being one of the names of Buddha. That Rajad is royal, I shall show by and by. Of Afghan I can make nothing, but in the travels of Ibn Battuta there is a place mentioned near Delphi called Afghanpur. The following passage I did not notice till I had written the whole, which the reader has seen respecting the tribe of Audai. I consider this under these circumstances a very valuable circumstantial evidence. This kind of coincidence I value more than direct authorities. Some of the ancient fathers, from terms ill understood, divided the first ages into 3 or more epochas, and have distinguished them by as many characteristics. Barbarismus, which is supposed to have preceded the flood. Scythismus, of which I have been speaking, and Hellenismus, or the Grecian period. This last must appear as extraordinary as any. For how was it possible for the Hellenic era to have existed before the name of Hellas was known, or the nation in being? I suppose the reader, after having read what I have said relating to the Ionians, does not require to answer the question. To this Mr. Brandt adds in a note, in like manner of the fourth heresy is supposed to have arisen styled Judaismus before the time of either the Jews or Israelites. Unquote. Here the tribe of Yadu or Judai or Ayud, of which I have treated, is evident, which these fathers could not help seeing, but of which they could not understand the origin or meaning. Number 6. The existence of Ionian or Hellenistic heresy, as well as in its antiquity, is clearly recognized by several of the fathers. Eusebius says, Sirach was the first who introduced the false worship called Hellenismus. Epiphanius says, Rajim or Ragan had for his son Saruk when idolatry and Hellenismus first began among men. Johannes Antiochus styles the people of Midian Hellenes, and speaking of Moses, who married the daughter of Jethro the Cuthite, the priest of Midian, who represents the woman, as the daughter of Jothar, the high priest of Hellenes. The introduction or adoption of Hellenism or Ionism by Sirach several generations before Abraham is as much in favor of my hypothesis as anything can be. Then right here he says, Mr. Franklin says, another striking instance is recorded by the very intelligent traveler Wilson regarding a representation of the fall of our first parents, sculpted in the magnificent temple of Ipsambul in Nubia. He says that that's so funny too, Ipsambul, okay? In Nubia. He says that a very exact representation of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden is to be seen in that cave, and that the serpent climbing around the tree is especially delineated, and the whole subject of the tempting of our first parents most accurately exhibited. How is this fact of the mythos of the second book of Genesis being found in Nubia, probably 1,000 miles above Heliopolis, to be accounted for, except that it came from Upper India? See, he's not getting it yet. He don't know. with the first Buddhist, or Gymnosophists. There, they were found by Clemens Alexandrinus, and there they founded a Meru called Meroe. The same mythos is found in India. Colonel Todd says a drawing brought by Colonel Combs from a sculptured column in a cave temple in the south of India represents the first pair at the foot of the ambrosial tree, and a serpent entwined among the heavenly laden boughs, presenting them from some fruit from his mouth. The tempter appears to be at part of his discourse, when, replete with guile, into her heart too eased the entranced one, fixed on the fruit she gazed. Throughout all the ancient world, the distinction between the followers of Yoni and Linga may be seen. All nations seem to have been Ionians except the Jews and the Persians, and as the Jewish or male principle prevailed, the other declined. There's two, androgynous, the male and the female side. That's what we've been talking about recently. So that's the chapters I wanted to go through on that one with y'all real quick. Right? So now we finna get up out of this bad boy, and we finna be in volume 2. Okay, so we finna get in this thing for real. Volume 2 is not playing, y'all. It's not playing at all. It's actually pretty wild. So let's get going. Alright. So Lord Kingsborough on Mexico, and just a whole bunch of information. I don't even need to read it. Let's go. Number 1, I must now draw, and again this is volume 2 of Godfrey Higgins and Anacalypsis. I must now draw my reader's attention to perhaps the most curious of all the subjects hitherto discussed, and that is the history of Mexico and Peru. It might be supposed that these, of all nations, were the least likely to afford any useful information respecting the system or mythos which I have been unveiling, but they are, in fact, rich in interesting circumstances that have hitherto been totally inexplicable, but which are easily explained on the hypothesis that there was, in very early times, a universal empire governed by a learned priesthood. Where'd it start at, baby? Yeah. Many months after the Anacalypsis had been in the press, Lord Kingsborough's magnificent work on Mexico made its appearance. This will account for the manner in which I have spoken of Mexican hieroglyphics in the first volume. It's so weird that it says that. I'm kind of confused on this. My reader will readily believe me when I say it was with great pleasure I discovered in every part of the work circumstances which can only be accounted for in the theory laid down by me, and which therefore confirm it in a very remarkable manner. You see what I'm saying? He laid down the theory showing that there was migration or movement differing from what was being projected or put forth, and now that Lord Kingsborough's books come out, it's all coming together. It's all coming together. Now he finally get it. All those things he didn't get, it's now coming together. And here we go. This is what we getting from it. His lordship's difficulties are very striking. The language of the Jews, their mythos, laws, customs are everywhere apparent. This his lordship accounts for by supposing that in ancient times colonies of Jews went to America from Alexandria. But this is by no means accounts for the difficulty, because the Trinity, the crucifixion, and other doctrines of Christianity are intermixed with every part of the Jewish rites, which must be accounted for. Therefore, to remove this new difficulty, he is obliged to suppose that Christian missionaries in the early times of the gospel found their way to America. Now, admitting this to have taken place, its insufficiency to account for the various incomprehensible circumstances, if not already, will very shortly be clearly proved. The South Americans had not the knowledge of letters when the Spaniards arrived among them, nor did they know of the use of iron. These facts are of themselves almost enough to prove, and really do prove, when combined with other circumstances, that the Jewish customs and doctrines could not have been carried to them from Alexandria, as above suggested, or by modern Christians, who would have instantly set them to digging their mountains. But, on the contrary, these facts prove that the colonization must have taken place previous to the discovery of iron by the natives of the Old World, long before Alexandria was built, and this agrees very well with their ignorance of the use of an alphabet. These two facts exhibit the mythos in existence at a period extremely remote indeed, for the identity of rites such as circumcision, etc., found in India, Syria, Egypt, and South America puts the great antiquity and identity of these mythoses out of all doubt. Number 2, David Macomb, in his book called Antiquities of Britain, which is so ingeniously contrived that it cannot be referred to by chapter, number, page, or in any other way, gives the following passage as an extract from Solomon's Modern History. St. Owston, speaking of the notion some entertained of another continent, he says, "It is not agreeable to reason or good sense to affirm that men may pass over so great an ocean as the Atlantic from this continent to a new-found world, or that there are inhabitants there, all men being descended from the first man, Adam." I don't agree with that, but okay. Now, this shows that from the time of Christ to the 4th century, when the African bishop lived, but then resided at Rome, there had been no colonization. It was impossible to have taken place without his knowledge, and this absolutely proves the truth of the existence of the mythos before the time of Christ. The jealousy of the Pope and the court of Spain in keeping all strangers away from South America, even to the extreme length, for many years, of excluding their own bishops and secular clergy, and permitting no priests but Dominicans and Franciscans to go thither, is accounted for. So you see right there, he talking about like, yo, they wasn't letting nobody come over here for quite a while. Like, nobody. They knew what was up, and they had to eliminate that before they could start, at least what they, it was, hey, they were like, wait, what's going on? Why can't we, The clear and unquestionable doctrines of Judaism and Christianity, which must have existed before the time of Christ, evidently overthrew all their vulgar, esoteric doctrines, whatever they might do with the esoteric or those in the conclave. Lord Kingsborough says, but one solution offers itself from all the difficulties and mysteries which seem to be inseparable from the study of the ancient monuments, paintings, and mythology of the Mexicans, and that is, the presence of the Jews in the New World. Had his lordship said the Judaic mythos, he would have been right, for nothing can be more clear than that it is all substantially there, and most intimately mixed, actually amalgamated, he might have added, with the Christian. Now what's amazing is you're seeing here, this is the volume 2 Anacalypsis. You see how much has changed now. You're already noticing how much he sees how it all links. Let's keep going. So number 3, the similarity between the Jews, the Christians, and the South Americans is sufficiently striking, but there is yet something to me still more so, which is that several of the doctrines which I have advocated in this work, unknown to the vulgar Jews and Christians of this day, are to be found in Mexico. Their triune God, their creator, is called by the names of Yahweh and Hom. Lord Kingsborough says, quote, Hom Eoka, which signifies the place in which exists the creator of the universe, or the first cause, to whom they gave the name of Hom Etuli, which means the God of threefold dignity, or three gods, the same as Ol Hombres, and by another name, Hom Mekan, that is to say, the place of the Holy Trinity, which, according to the opinion of many of their old men, begot by the word Sibatenal, and a woman called Shiyumio. In the Homeoka, when joined with the other circumstances, I cannot but recognize the and Ia place of Hom, and again in Hom Iakan, the Ael, Ania, the place or country of the self-existent, who is called the Trinity. And what are we to make of the Hom, the father of the word, by the Logos? The father of the American Trinity is called Ekuturki, o bien Ragos o Riso. Here, the of North India, the Urus or Bive, and the Piru, Pirua, Piru, that is, the Ra, are distinct. These have evidently not come from modern Christianity, but from the ancient system in the most ancient of times. Teutl is repeatedly said to mean God. Sahagún says the Mexicans had a god, the same as Bacchus, called Emetutli, Ometeuchtli. Here is clearly Bacchus by his name, who is called, which equals 608, which was the name of Jesus Christ, called the desire of all nations, the Nual of Isaiah. Here in the Deut, we have not only of the Greeks, but we have the Deutates of the British Druids, and the Thoth of Egypt, and the Buddha of India under this name, Tat. But it is expressly said in several other places that the god was called Yao. How can anyone doubt that here are the remains of an ancient system, the ancient system, the original before it got branched off into everything else, y'all? Can't you see? Now they see. How can anyone believe that the Jews would carry all these recondite matters to Mexico, even if they did go at any time, and that they would amalgamate them all together as we have them here? He's saying, how could they carry everything that they did and develop it if it was not already been developing from time immemorial? You see what I'm saying? Like, it had always been here. It's where it originated. That's how deep it goes. All these matters. You see what I'm saying? The Mexican history gives a long account of their arrival in Mexico from a distant country far to the west. The stations where the colony rested from time to time during its long migration, which took many years, are particularly described, and it is said that ruins of the towns which they occupied are to be seen in several places along the coast. See, they always do it on the coast, but they ain't looking up and going straight back to the mound builders, you dig? They ain't going up that Mississippi, but maybe it's because they were going up a coast. You see what I'm saying? But the whole landmass was different and flooded with a whole bunch of more seas. I think it is evident that this migration from the west is merely a mythos. So okay, there we go. Well, hey, appreciate you. The circumstances are such to render it totally incredible. In principle, it is the same as that of the Jews, but accommodated the circumstances of the New World. It really seems impossible to read Lord Kingsborough's notes in page 241 and not to see that the mythos of a chosen people and a god conducting them after long migrations to a promised land, attributed by the Spanish monks to the contrivance of the devil, was common to Jews, Christians, and Mexicans. I think it seems clear from page 186 that Mexico, or Mexico, was the Hebrew Meshi. Then it would be the country of the Messiah, or it might equally be the country of the leader, whom we call Moses, of the people of whom we have found in western Syria, in South India, and Kashmir. His lordship shows that the word Mesitli, or Mexico, is precisely the same as the Hebrew word Meshi, or anointed, and that one of these gods should sit on the right hand of the other. In the next page he says, the full accomplishment of the prophecy of a savior in the person of Quetzalcoatl has been acknowledged by the Jews in America. The temptation of Quetzalcoatl, the fast of 40 days, ordained by the Mexican ritual, the cup with which he was presented to drink, the reed which was his sign, the morning star which he has designated, the teparo, or stone which was laid on his altar, and called Dio Tecparo, or divine stone, which was likewise an object of adoration. All these circumstances, connected with many others relating to Quetzalcoatl, which are here omitted, are very curious and mysterious. But why are they omitted by his lordship? The pious monks accounted for all these things by the agency of the devil and burned all the hieroglyphic books containing them whenever it was in their power. This migration of the Mexicans from the west, or if we really want to get it right, from the north, is evidently exactly similar to the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt. The going out with great noise and clamor is a part of the mythos. Nimrod was shown that it is to be found among the Greeks in their Bacchic festivals, and also among the Romans. See his second volume, article Populi Fugia. The meaning of the mythos I cannot even suspect, and the nonsense of Nimrod about Babel and the horrors of gynocracy give no assistance. But the fact of the similarity of the histories proves that it really is a part of the mythos, that is, that the Regifugia and the Populi Fugia is part of the mythos. On the religion of the Hindus, and Cambridge Key says, the pristine religion of the Hindus was, I think, that of the most pure and ancient Catholic faith, and the religion of the enlightened few still continues such. They have worshipped a Savior as the Redeemer of the world for more than 4,800 years. The religion of their forefathers they brought with them from the old world, the true old world, and established it in the new one. They believed implicitly in a Redeemer, who they consider. Now, did you hear what he said, though? He said the religion, right here, the religion of their forefathers, and he's talking about of the Hindus' forefathers, they brought with them from the old world and established it in the new one, which was over there. They believe implicitly in a Redeemer, whom they consider as the spirit that moved on the waters of the creation, the God that existed before all worlds. We shall find this. The Mexican faith. You see, he's telling you straight up. He's telling you. It all came from America. They finally figured it out at this time. Why are we still playing games with ourselves? This is before they tied it into the mound builders and really figured out what was going on with the mound builders. This is before we found thousands upon thousands of more structures underneath the Amazon forest and all throughout North America, all the ones that's been destroyed. Y'all gotta quit playing with us. This is the true old world. This is the true old land. We continue to find more and more things here before all, and there are deeper in every regard as well. The god who led the Mexicans in their migration was called Yao Teotl, the god of armies. Yao being said to mean army or victory, the very meaning given to it by the Jews. In Sanskrit, scholars tell me, also by the Indians, Teo is said to be Deo and Titl, a mere termination, but as I have stated, TTL is T300, and TT is, in fact, the Tat or Buddha of India. Teotu is the same as Tilt and means 650, which, as emblem of the Trinitarian God, came to mean 3. I believe also that this has a connection, in some way, with the Tult, probably originally Tult or Tulad, the male organ of a generation. I believe that from this comes our word, Lad. Teotl is the supreme and invisible being. Teotl is the supreme and invisible being. The Tat is the name of the Tartars, who are as often called Tatars, and I am persuaded that the famous Titans were properly Tatans. Many reasons for these matters will be added hereafter. Now, General Valency says the earliest Irish history begins with Cartuelta, which is in the same as the Indo-Scythian Siar Tiutli, that is, Kaiser or Caesar, grandsons of Noah, on the banks of the Caspian 300 years after the flood. Here I suspect that we have the Caesar of Indo-Scythia or of the Caspian joined to the Mexican Teutli or Teotli. You see what they did to ya? You see what they did to ya? The connections are there, he's saying, but what they did is they moved them around. You see? Number 4. In page 216, Mr. Humboldt treats of a nation called Xochimex. Xochimex. This must be Sacamalec, or I should rather say, considering all other circumstances which have seen relating to the Rajaputans and royal shepherds, royal Saxons, for I much suspect they were all the same people. The Marquis Spinetto, in his lectures, have quoted a person called Carli as having deeply studied the origin of nations and languages, and who, he says, has asserted that the Egyptians peopled America. Now it's the other way around, but it's all good. He particularly notices a word as being held sacred among the Egyptians, and in the Pacific Ocean it is the Bao. But this is nothing but Bauta, read anagrammatically Or, in fact, in the old Hebrew fashion, the high priest of the North American Indians was called Sachem. I think we have here both the Saga and the Acme, and also the Xiakam, which we have before noticed in Tibet. The dignity of sacrificer was supreme and hereditary, like a feudal title. His title was Papa, his dress scarlet, with fringes as a border. This exactly answers to the Sagart and the Rex Sacrificulis of the ancients. The fringes of the Mexicans were fixed to the four corners of their garments as a sacred ordinance, precisely like those of the Jews, and it is only fair to suppose, as they were similar in one respect, they should be so in another, and have been descriptive of the number 600. The number 5. But Bottorini says, no pagan nation refers primitive events to fixed dates like the Indians, meaning the Americans. They recount to us the history of the creation of the world, of the deluge, of the confusion of tongues, at the time of the Tower of Babel, of the other epochs and ages of the world, of their ancestors' long travels in Asia, with the years precisely distinguished by their corresponding characters. They record in the year of 7 rabbits, the great eclipse which happened at the crucifixion of Christ our Lord, and the first Indians who were converted to Christianity, who, at that time, were perfectly well acquainted with their own chronology, and applied themselves with the utmost diligence to ours, have transmitted to us the information that from the creation of the world to the happy nativity of Christ 5,199 years have elapsed, which is the opinion or computation of the LLX. One of the periods is 4008 years BC, another is 4801. Their fourth age, the editor says, according to the Mexican symbols, lasted 5206 or 5,206 years, and the early Christian converts made it out 5,199 years. This was evidently the computation of 55,200 years of Eusebius. The period of 4801 is the sum of the 8 ages of the correct Neros. 8 times 600 equals 4,800. The Mexicans are said to be great astrologers. Yeah, we know, buddy, thanks. The Mexicans believed that the millennium would commence at the end of some cycle of 52 years. 4 times 13 equals 52. And they concluded each of these periods with deep lamentations and tears, and hailed with corresponding joy the moment when the new cycle had commenced, which showed that they had a new 52-year lease. This was exactly the case with the lamentations for the death of Osiris, Adonis, etc., and his resurrection from the tomb. See? So you just saying, oh, well, I think they come from Egypt. Bro, this over here, bro. Like, what? What you talking about? Like, that was over here first? What you mean? The new cycle having commenced, the danger had passed. At first, I doubt not, this was only every 600 years. Afterward, with the increasing uncertainty of the ends of those periods, and also with the increase of superstition, the festivals of Osiris, etc., came, for the sake of security, to be celebrated every year. Lord Kingsborough says the Christians might have feared the return of every period of 52 years as being nearly the anniversary of the age of which Christ had attained when he was crucified, and of the great eclipse which sacred history records, in which, since profane history is silent respecting it, it is very remarkable how the Mexicans should have become acquainted with. Now, did you hear that? It's so funny. Listen, watch this. Christians might have feared the return of every period of 52 cycles as being nearly the anniversary of the age which Christ had attained when he was crucified, and of the great eclipse which the sacred history records, and which, since profane history is silent respecting it, is very remarkable how the Mexicans should have become acquainted with. You see what I'm saying here? So right here, what is he saying? Christ's real age, not given to the profane, is 52. That's why we have a number 7 being so important. Okay? So all those people talking about 33 vertebrae and the Christ, that might just be a hijack that you're putting forth. Possibly. I have to dig on it some more, y'all. That's kind of interesting to me. I've never really come across that. The first pair were called Hue Hue, Wacha, Hue Hue, Tlapala, Kue Ka Coatl. The first pair, too. That means the first pair of beings were called Hue Hue. Kweka, Kowado. That means America, y'all. Old. Hue Hue Tlapalan is America. Kwe, Ka, Kowado disappeared at the end of 52 years at the great festival in Cholula. Here is the Amphanasia. So, if we really got it where Kweka Kowado disappeared at the end of 52 years, and then you got Jesus disappearing, and apparently his real age was 52 years. Yo, that's wild, y'all. That's very wild. And I can see why something like that would be held away from us. First time I've come across it, but we're going to have to dig on that one. Now, Mr. Humboldt gives nearly the same account. He says, at the end of 52 years, they had a grand festival when all lights were extinguished, and after crucifying a man, they kindled a fire by the friction of the wood of the ivy on his breast, from which they were all relighted. It was their belief that the world would be destroyed at the end of one of these cycles, and as soon as the fire was kindled and the critical moment passed which assured them that a new cycle was to run, they indulged in the greatest joy. He shows that they new cleaned and furnished all their houses and temples precisely as was done by the ancient Egyptians, and he might have added, as is also done by the Romish Church at every Jubilee. He shows that Mexicans had convents of monks precisely like the Tibetans and the Romish Church. Priests, kings, boy, you better get it right. After this, Humboldt states that Mr. Laplace, from a careful examination, had come to the conclusion that the Mexicans knew the length of the tropical year more correctly than Hipparchus, and almost as correctly as Almanman. And he shows from various astronomical circumstances that they must have had a close connection with the Eastern Asia and its cycles. Humboldt says this predilection for periodical series and the existence of a cycle of 60 years appear to reveal the Tartarian origin of the nations of the new continent. He then states that the cycle of 60 years was divided into 4 parts. These small cycles represented the 4 seasons of the great year. Each of them contained 185 moons, which corresponded with 15 Chinese and Tibetan years, and consequently with the real indictions observed in the time of Constantine. Here we see the identity accounted for of the chronological period stated above by Lord Kingsborough, with those of the Old World as corrected by the 2 Caesars with the assistance of the Chaldeans of the East. On this I shall have something very curious in a future book. Mr. Niebuhr says, what we call Roman numerals are Etruscan and frequently seen on their monuments, but these signs are of the hieroglyphic kind and belong to an earlier mode of symbolical writing. In use before the introduction of alphabetical characters, they resemble the Aztecan in this, and they represent objects individually. They were of native origin at the time when the West, with all its primitive peculiarities, was utterly unknown to the East, at the same period when the Tordetani framed their written characters and language. Here also a phenomenon presents itself which fills us moderns with astonishment, and an exceedingly accurate measurement of time, and even in the cyclical year, quite in the spirit in which the early Mexican legislators conducted the chronology. Portions of time measured off from periods of very long duration, determined with astronomical precision and without regard to the lunar changes. Besides these, the Etruscans had a civil lunar year, which the cyclical only served to correct. But there is something remarkable, and not only to be lightly discarded, in the affinity between the wisdom of the ancient West and the science, at one time perhaps more widely diffused over that hemisphere, and of which the Mexicans still preserved the hereditary, though probably useless possession, at the time when the country was destroyed. This deserves more attentive consideration since the discovery of an analogy between the Basque and the American languages by a celebrated scholar, Professor Vatir. In these observations, we purely have a very extraordinary confirmation of my theory. If the Romans calculated by a period of a saculum of 120 years, they would come to the same conclusions as if they took the 60 or 600, and in this we see why the Mexican and Roman periods agree in the time of Constantine and Eusebius. They would not have agreed before the time when the solstice was corrected by the Sosigenes, the Chaldean. And when we talking about the Sosigenes, the Chaldean, now we get into specifics in relation to the wise men that were asked to come or convoked to come to North America, or Huehuetlapalan, to fix the calendar. This exact thing, the solstice. So now what we have done in our research is taking it from knowing that we had astrologers to what it was about, which was the solstice, and then now we have a direct person who is Sosigenes, the Chaldean. Okay, and where did he come to? We got records now that's showing that he was convoked to Huehuetlapalan, which is North America, to fix the calendar, y'all. They would have varied more than 500 years. This we shall refer to in a future book. Humboldt says the Mexicans hold that before the flood, which took place 4,800 years after the creation of the world, the earth was inhabited by giants. One of them, after the flood, called Xilhua, or the architect, built an immense pyramidal tower which was to reach heaven, but the gods offended, destroyed it with lightning. Here is a complete jumble of the ancient mythology. The 4,800 are the 8 cycles before Christ. The architect is the megalistor, or the name of God made into the giant, and is Zialhua, the self-existent X. Why do you think that symbol is so important? The self-existent. You are self-existent. You are the X. You are both in one. Man, yo, you gotta understand how it really works. Who you really are. The matter and the non-matter. The tower is the exact model of the Tower of Babel, as given in our old histories. After its destruction, it was dedicated to Quetzalcoatl, the god of air. This is Saka, or Indra, whom we found crucified in Nepal. The Mexicans chanted the word Hululaes, which belonged to no Mexican dialect, to the honor of their gods. This is evidently the Alleluia of the Greeks and Hebrews, and the Ulalu of the Irish. Number 6. It is said that after the deluge sacrificing commenced, the person who answers to Noah entered an ark with 6 others, and that soon after the deluge, his descendants built the tower of Tulon, Cholula, partly to see what was going on in heaven, and partly for fear of another deluge. But it was destroyed by thunder and lightning. The story of sending birds out of the ark, the confusion and dispersion of tribes, is the same in general character with that of the Bible. His lordship says, in attempting to explain how the Indians could have become acquainted with events of such remote antiquity coeval with the foundation of the earliest monarchies, it would be absurd to suppose that their annals and native traditions extended backward to a period unknown to Egyptian, Persian, Greek, or Sanskrit history. Absurd as it may be to suppose this, their hieroglyphic annals evidently do thus extend backwards. So what you gotta understand is that everything originated here in America from what I'm seeing and what everybody else is seeing, and then it spread out to the rest of the world after a cataclysm, right? But apparently people were still here and survived. There's no doubt about it, you dig? They spread out across the world, you feel me? And as they spread out, they forgot about where they originally came from. They made what they made, imitating and getting greater from where it originally started in North America, right? And they got greater and greater in their things, but forgot where they truly originally came from in the first place. But America was always here, you know? America was always here, the birthplace of it all. That's what I'm thinking. His lordship says the difficulty of comprehending the plan of the Tower of Belus, given by Herodotus, vanishes on inspecting the plans of the Mexican temples. The turrets in the great temple described in were 360 in number. Up to the temple Cholula, the brick base of the tower of Cholulan, which remains and was built in order to escape another flood if it should come, is 1,800 feet in circumference. It is said to have been destroyed by a stone from heaven. It is pyramidal. Humboldt says it is hollow. I have little doubt that the word Chol has been XL 650, a monogram, which, it may be remembered, is found in the oldest catacombs at Rome. Teocalli is the name of the temple of Cholula. This is said to be the house of Teocalli. This is evidently Teo, or God, Kali. This is evidently Teo, or God, Kali. House of God is precisely the Hebrew style. The word Cholula is thought by Lord Kingsborough to be a corruption of the word Jerusalem. He thinks the same of a place called Chorola, but I suspect that they were identical. At Cholula is a very large temple, with the very celebrated pyramid, which is said to be a very close imitation of the Temple of Belus or the Tower of Babel. A room in one of the pyramids of Cholula has its ceiling formed like the Temple of Kolmilmar of overhanging stones. Now, in volume 21 of the Classical Journal will be found some interesting remarks of Mr. Favors on the close similarity between the pyramid on the mountain Cholula of the Mexicans and the Tower of Belus, that one is a copy of the other, and that they are both taken from some common mythos cannot possibly be doubted. This being premised, I would ask my reader whether he can doubt a moment that the well-known deity Omorka of the Chaldeans is the Homeoc god of the Mexicans. Thus, we have not only the mythos of the Greeks and Bacchus, of Christianity, of Judaism, of Tartary, and of North and South India in Mexico, but we have the very oldest mythos of Babylon. How come this mythos of Babylon be in Mexico? How came it? Do you understand? Do you see what everybody is understanding in 1836, everyone? Okay? Why do you think they brought in a educational system? Why do you think they started up a world war a couple times? Okay? There's reasons for this. Give themselves some time. I think my reader, when he considers all these circumstances, must see that my theory of one universal empire and mythos will explain all the difficulties, and that it alone can't explain them. Atlantis is the Hebrews. The Hebrews are Atlantis. The Israelites. All of that is intertwined directly in America. Mr. Humboldt, after showing that the Tower of Cholula was in every respect a close imitation of that described by Diodorus and Herodotus at Babylon, both in its form and in the astronomical uses to which it was applied, states, as if it was not doubted but a settled fact, that it was built after the time of Mohammed. At this time, the Tower of Belus had for many centuries been in ruins, and its country a perfect desert. This at once shows that no dependence can be placed in Mr. Humboldt's speculation on this subject, for surely no one will credit the recent date of this work, supposing even if it were built by immigrants from Egypt or from Chinese Tartary in that age, after the time of Mohammed, which should induce either Jews or Christians to expend an immense sum of money or labor to build a Tower of Babel in Mexico or anywhere else. After the description of the Mexican pyramidal towers, Mr. Humboldt goes on to state that there are similar pyramidal towers in Virginia and Canada, containing galleries lined with stone. He states that the Temple of Xochicalco, accurately to face the four cardinal points, to be built of stone beautifully wrought, but without cement, each stone in the form of a parallelepiped. The Mexicans' large temple, placed on a conical hill called Xochicalco, meant, as they say, house of flowers. This is Zaca, and Calix, which meant rose. The hill was excavated into large caves, wonderful to behold when it is considered, as it is there observed, that the Mexicans had no iron. An observation is made by Mr. Dupas that the Mexicans are now quite ignorant of the meaning of their proper names. It appears that the temple at Mexico is, in substance and fact, called the Temple of Sinate, C being pronounced as S, and thus making the Temple of Sin, or Sion, which will be explained in the book on letters. Lord Kingsborough calls it Sinai, or Sina. I feel little doubt that one of the first names of God in the first written languages, for reasons which I shall give when I explain the origin of letters in all nations, languages, and times, would be Divas. With its variety of forms, the next perhaps would be descriptive of 360. This might be described in various ways as TLI, equaling 360. The meaning of these three numbers would be glorious orb we daily behold, the sun, and God. For reasons which I shall assign, I suppose D as the first and the prevailing name of God during many generations. Afterward, when astronomy so much improved that the knowledge of the Neros, or the Neros, of 650 was acquired, the name TTL 650 was adopted in his name. And we have it in Mexico, where figures were known, but not syllabic letters, in the name of the deity Teotl. The periods show how far, at the time in which they branched off from Asia, the knowledge of the system had extended. Their period from the creation of Christ of 5,200 years embraces the 8 ages of their cycle, their TTL, Teotl, 650 times 8 equals 5,200, corresponding with the period of Eusebius. In India, the name 360 fell into disuse and was lost, and was probably superseded by the words Titlu 666, TTL 650 plus IU or IU equals 16 equals 666, and at last by the number now used, TT 600. I know not how I could have invented anything more in accordance with my theory than that this Mexican god should have this peculiar appropriate name, had I set my wits to work for the purpose of invention. Teotl signifies in the Mexican language both the sun and an age, and the image of the sun, surrounded with rays, was the symbol of the latter. Mr. Fred Schlegel has observed the word Atl or Atel is found in the language of the east of Europe, that it meant water, and that its symbol was found its way into the Greek alphabet in the letter Mem, in the undulating shape by which water is meant. Look at that, y'all. Yes, perfect. It matches so great. I love it. That is also in the Phoenician in most Western nations. It is in the Istotlan of Greenland, which is, I suspect, Die Ania Istotl, and I suspect that it is the symbol of the centered letter and of water, because it is the symbol of fluid of any kind. I think this leads to the meaning of our word land, Alania, the holy country. Almost all persons who have written respecting the Mexicans have observed the similarity of their language to that of the Hebrews. This and many other strange things the monks admit most unwillingly and attribute to the devil. Las Casas said that the language of Saint Domingo was corrupt Hebrew. The Caribbees have the word Neketali, meaning dead, in Hebrew. Hilali, he is dead, in Hebrew. Hilt, Kanich, a cane, sugar, in Hebrew. King, Inika, a collar, in Hebrew. Hunk. I don't know how to say those. Las Casas wrote an account of the Mexicans, in which we are told he states his belief that they are descended from the Jews. This account, by his desire, was never published, but why should he object to its being known that the Mexicans descended from the Jews? The reason is very evident. It was because he saw it was ridiculous, and he did not believe it himself. This book is in the Academy of History at Madrid. It was examined a few years ago by the government, but it was not thought proper to publish it. Lord Kingsborough gives the following passage. Las Casas' persuasion that the Indians were descended from the Jews is elsewhere mentioned, but as the words were discovered, with some other reasons tending towards the same conclusion, by Torquemada in some private papers containing the will of Las Casas, at the same time that great weight must be attached to the solemnly recorded an opinion, it cannot be said that that learned prelate was guilty of any indiscretion in promulgating it, but the contrary was proved by the proviso which he made respecting the publication of his history, that it should not be printed till 50 years after his death, and then only if it appeared good to the superior of his order, and for the benefit of religion, but that in the intermediate time no layman or young ecclesiastic was to be permitted to read it. The work has never been published, and Don Martin Fernandez de Navarrete says that when it was referred some years ago to the Academy of History at Madrid to take their decision respecting its publication, they did not think it convenient. So you see what's going on. They had already knew back even at this time what was going on, but they didn't find it convenient to publish it. They was like, hey, we're just not going to say anything because this isn't going to vibe with our control system and what we got going on. So yeah, like, just let's not do this right now. Let's just keep things as they are. They can find out the truth on their own later, if they want to. They got free will. You know how they think. I now learn that permission has been given to Lord Kingsborough to copy it. The secreting practice is found to answer no longer. The old proverb applies. I shall be surprised if anything important be found in it. as much as I should have been to have heard that the French found many diamonds at Loreto when they got there, or secret learning in the Vatican Library when they got to Rome. Dr. Malcolm, in his essay on the antiquities of Britain, says, take it in the sense of Whitefleet, thus PM 12, which in substance amounts to this, etc. When the Spaniards were in the Magna Insula in Dice Haiti, when the bell rung for evening prayers, the Spaniards, according to custom, bowed their knees and sighed themselves with the cross. The Indians did imitate them with great reverence, falling down on their knees and joining their hands together, rather, as I think, for imitation than for any other reason, though there are several who think that the Indians had the cross in veneration long before the arrival of Columbus. Gomorrah, Book 3, Chapter 32 tells that St. Andrew's Cross, which is the same with that of Burgundy, was in the very great veneration among the Cumans, and that they fortified themselves with the cross against the incursions of evil spirits, and were in use to put them upon newborn infants, which thing very justly deserves admiration. Neither can it be conceived how such a rite should prevail among savages unless they have learned this adoration of the cross from mariners or strangers who, being carried thither by the violence of tempests, have died or been buried there, which without all doubt would have also happened to that Andalusian pilot who died in the house of Columbus, unless he had been very skillful in the sea affairs, and so had observed his course, when he was hurried away with the force of the storms. It is very credible that many of those who are generally reckoned to have been foundered at sea did really meet with accidents of this kind. But the Accusa Milenes bring another reason of adorning the cross, and which seems near the truth, to it that they had received by tradition from their forefathers that formerly a man more glorious than the sun had passed through these countries and suffered on a cross. Here we have the mythos clear enough in Hispaniola. So, didn't come from somewhere else. The mythos is already clear enough that the cross originated here. So quit trying to bring it from somewhere else and saying that it was brought here. It wasn't brought here. The mythos is already clear. The Reverend Dr. Hyde, speaking of the priests of Peru, takes occasion to say, no wonder the University of Oxford refused to print any more of his manuscripts. He was speaking of a virgin of Peru who was pregnant by the sun. The Reverend Doctors of Oxford did right not to publish his works while he lived and to destroy his manuscripts when he died. He ought to have been burnt himself. Whoa, what are they talking about? Acosta says that the Americans adorned the sea under the name of Mamacocha. I believe this was the marine Venus Mama Cochab. The Mexicans baptized their children in the water which they called the water of regeneration. The Mexican king danced before the god and was consecrated and anointed by the high priest with holy unction. On one day of the year, all the fires were put out and lighted again from one sacred fire in the temple, the practice of the Druids. Lord Kingsborough shows that the Messiah of the Jews is foretold to have an ugly or marred countenance, and that the Mexican Quetzalcoatl is said to have had the same. At the end of October, they had a festival exactly answering to our All Saints and All Souls. They called it the Festival of Advocates, because each human being had an advocate to plead for him. Thus, we have this festival throughout modern Europe, in Tibet, and in the ancient festival of the Druids, Saman, in Ireland, and in Mexico. This is Halloween, y'all. There is the story of the rebellious angels and the war in heaven. This is not from our Pentateuch. This is not from our Pentateuch, the rebellious angels and the war in heaven. Everything we've been talking about recently, y'all. If you ain't been with me on Brazier de Berg, hey, it's all, we getting to it. Number 9. The Peruvians had a festival called the Festival of Pacacreme, in the first month of their year, called Rame. Acosta supposes this was contrived by the devil in imitation of the Passover. It may be observed that all the acts of worship are directly avowed to the sun. The Mexicans sacrificed human victims, which Lord Kingsborough has shown was practiced by the Jews, who were, according to his lordship account, horrible cannibals. Georgius shows that the god Zaka was constantly called Sio. This was the Sio de Cutli, or god of fire, or god of years, or the everlasting one of the Mexicans. Volney says the Teleutians are a Tartar nation. Buddha was Hermes, and Hermes was Mercury, and Mercury was the god of merchants, and Buddha was Zaka and Saka, and the Mexican god of merchants was Yaca Tecutli. In the history of the Aztecs of Mexico, we find much respecting one Cocox, saved on a raft in a great flood. Now, when I consider that the Mexicans are so closely connected with North India, and that their accounts are all preserved by a mixture of hieroglyphics and unwritten tradition, I cannot help suspecting that this Cocox ought to be Sasox or Saksas. Nagaalism is a doctrine known in American. Naga is softened or corrupted, and the hog of England, where the serpent is called Culebra. This is Colubra, and the followers of it are called Shavim. These are the Evites, or Hivites, or Ophites. Eve is Hiva, or Hiva. The Mexicans had a 40 days fast in memory of one of their sacred persons who was tempted 40 days on a mountain. He drinks through a reed. He is called the morning star, etc., etc. This must be the same person noticed before to have had a reed for an emblem. As Lord Kingsborough says, these are things which are very curious and mysterious. The inhabitants of Florida chant the word Hosanna in their religious service, and their priests were named Joannes. Sina is the ancient name of China. I suspect Sina or Sian or Siam are the same word. The god of Haiti was called Shokana. The C is evidently instead of the asparate in Johanna. One of the temples has the name of Sinatiocali, that is, I suppose, the temple of Kali, the god of Sina or Sian. Lord Kingsborough says the Mexicans honor the cross. They knew them, the Charibians or Charibichineses, which name differs from that of Chibibrias, the mother of Bacab, honor the cross. The Incas had a cross of very fine marble or beautiful jasper, highly polished, of one piece, 3/4 of an ell in length and 3 fingers in width and thickness. It was kept in a sacred chamber of a palace and held in great veneration. The Spaniards enriched this cross with gold and jewels and placed it in the Cathedral of Cusco. The Mexican temples are in the form of a cross and face the 4 cardinal points. Quetzalcoatl is represented in the paintings of the Codex Borgianus nailed to the cross. Sometimes even the 2 thieves are crucified with him. In Volume 2, Plate 75, the god is crucified in the heavens in a circle of 19 figures, the number of the Metonic cycle. A serpent is depriving him from the organs of generation. In the Codex Borgianus, the Mexican god is represented crucified and nailed to the cross, and in another place hanging to it with a cross in his hands. And in one instance where the figure is not merely outlined, the cross is red, the clothes are colored, and the face and hands quite black. If this was the Christianity of the German Nestorius, how came he to teach that the crucified Savior was black? The name of the god who was crucified was Quetzalcoatl. I suspect this is Saka or Saka or Kaka, the Coatl or god. The mother of Quetzalcoatl is called Xochiquetzal. May this be mother of Zaka. Xochi or Suchi Cueca is both male and female. In the Codex Borgianus, the burial, descent into hell, and the resurrection are represented. And one of the plates the god is crucified on a mountain. I suspect that this is Prometheus. The Immaculate Conception is described. This is also described in Torquemada's Indian monarchy. The Mexican word Dios meant God, and he was called ineffable. The Immaculate Conception is described in the Codex Vaticus. The Virgin Chimalman, also called Xochiquetzal or Suchiquetzal, was the mother of Quetzalcoatl. Xochiquetzal means the lifting up of roses. Eve is Yesanextli, and it is said she sinned by plucking roses. But in another place, these roses are called fruta del arbor. The Mexicans called the Father Ixona, the son of Bacab, and the Holy Ghost, Echva. This, they say, they received from their ancestors. The Lakshmi of India is called Kri. Lakshmi is El Akhum. Kri is. These are the same as the Mexican Sintiotl, i.e. Sintiotl, and Sintiotl is Kan or Kuntiotl, the Kunti, the name of the female generative principle in India. The Mexican Eve is called Xochiquetzal. A messenger from heaven announced to her that she should bear a son who should bruise the serpent's head. He presents her with a rose. This was the commencement of an age, which was called the Age of Roses. In India, this is called the Age of the Lotus, the water rose. Upon this, it may be observed that if this had been papist forgery, the woman, and not the seed of the woman, would have bruised the head. It may also be observed that if this had come from the western part of the old world since the time of Constantine, it would certainly have had the woman, and not the seed of the woman. Gosh, this is so good. All this history, the monkish writer is perfectly certain, is the invention of the devil. He's saying it correlates so well, it has to be the work of a devil. Somebody did it. It doesn't make sense. Like, their mind is blown. It's hard for them to fathom that it all started here, but it's so true. Xochiquetzal is called the Queen of Heaven. She conceived a son without connection with man, who is the god of air. This is the Immaculate Conception in the god Indra, whom we found crucified and raised from the dead in Nepal. The Mohammedans have a tradition that Christ was conceived by the smelling of a rose. Jeez, look at there. The temples of Quetzalcoatl were round. He was the inventor of temples in this form. In the 36th chapter of Marco Polo, an ancient account is given of the sacrifice in the province of Tanguth, a little north of Nepal, of a ram of a year old, which is said to be offered as a ransom for the child. The same is practiced among the Chinese. Torquemada says, two things are very remarkable. The first is that the parents of the children should have sold them and given them voluntarily for sacrifice. The second, that the sale itself should have taken place on the second day of this month, February, at the very time that we, who are Christians, celebrate the festival of the presentation of the Virgin without spot in the Temple of Jerusalem, holding in her arms her most blessed child, the Son of God, whose life was sold for the sin of the first woman who existed in the world, carrying him to present and make an offering of him, manifesting as it were to God the sacrifice which was afterwards to be accomplished on the tree of the cross. Jeez, that correlation there is hardcore. Oof. Number 11. Wow. Mr. Humboldt has written much respecting the Americans. It is a remarkable circumstance that it should never have occurred to him that the ignorance in the South Americans of the use of letters and iron were decisive circumstantial proofs of their very great antiquity, and their very early separation from the stock of the old world. But this great antiquity he considers proved from a variety of other circumstances. See, they don't want to account. Other circumstance, oh, it had to have been this. We can't all come from America. Yeah, watch out, dodge it. He says, it cannot be doubted that the greater part of the nations of America belong to a race of men who, isolated ever since the infancy of the world from the rest of mankind, exactly, exhibit in the nature and diversity of language, in their features, and the conformation of their skull, incontestable proofs of an early and complete separation. Except in the article language, he is quite right. Malcolm shows that the tauta in the American language means father, in Irish dad, Welsh tad, or taduis, Armoric tat, Cornish dad, and tas, Scotch dad, St. Kilda tat, and in Guatemala tat, in Old Italy tata, in Egypt tate, in Greek teta, in Old English daddy, the American tauta is the Indian tat. After showing at great length that the Mexicans must have had their mythology from Asia, east of the Indus, Mr. Humboldt observes that he finds among them neither the linga nor any of those figures with several heads and hands which characterize the paintings and figures of the Hindus. Well, guess what? Just because he didn't then, we have now, and it's deep. We just went through that, y'all, in Investigations Part 2 with the team. Y'all check that out. This ties right into it. They didn't know it then, but we just figured it all out recently. Shout out to the team. But he distinctly admits that he finds the doctrine of repeated regeneration in cycles. Now, this again seems to confirm my hypothesis that they migrated from the old world so early as to be these corruptions, early as the linga was. And it has induced me to review the early history of Buddhism and to make me suspect that, in its early works, the linga is not to be found. But that's not true. Again, we found it. And that it has only come into use when the division between the followers of the linga and the Oni began to arise, which caused the horrible civil religious wars noticed in my former volume. See, he wasn't around to see that the linga was erected, that we didn't have none here. Apparently he didn't know, or he didn't see none of them. So when he was speaking about it earlier, he had no clue what was going on. They had a phallic worship, but he didn't really understand that we have them here. So 12, the founder of the Peruvian nation was called Bochica, the sun, an emblem of the sun. He was high priest of Soga Moza. Here we have Saga. His wife was called Chia. Chia is nothing but Eva, corrupted, Isis, or the moon. He was described with 3 heads. Here, I think, are the Buddha and Trimurti of India. His priests were called Zeques and Zaques. These are Zakas or Sagas, or priests of wisdom. You can also throw Nagas in there too, since we talk about priests of wisdom. Humboldt says, the form of government given by Bochia or Bochica to the inhabitants of Bogota is very remarkable from its analogy with those of Japan and Tibet. The Incas of Peru united in their person the temporal and spiritual powers. The children of the sun were both priests and kings. The pontiffs or lamas, the successors of Bochica, were considered as heirs of his virtue and sanctity. The people flocked in crowds to offer presents to the high priest, visiting those places which were consecrated by the miracles of Bochica. In a very particular and pointed matter, this Bochica is said to be white or albus. This reminds me of the Sibyl pronounces the white so of Alba to be black. This reminds me that the Sibyl pronounces the white so of Alba to be black. Alba means white. Was Bochica Alba or LB L50B252. See, they play codes with these white and black words too. So you see what I'm saying right here? And this is something I kind of learned from Seven Bomar. So you got to watch out what will be going down with this stuff. He had a peculiar cycle of 13 years and another of 4 13s or 52. This looks as if there was some reference to our astrological instrument called playing cards, which certainly came from North India. This does not seem so wonderful when we consider that we have just found their cycles, the same as the indictions of Constantine. What is the Romish alb? The Peruvians believed in one supreme being, the creator of heaven and earth, called Viracocha, and Pachacamac, who had revealed to them his religion. The Mexicans called their great god Yao Ineffable and represented him by an eye in a triangle. The Mexicans called their great god Yao Ineffable and represented him by an eye in a triangle. The cross was everywhere adored. The Mexicans expected a Messiah. The history of the flood is almost a close copy of that of Moses. Their baptism in the presence of witness is almost the same as that of the Jews and Persians, and in the same manner they named their children and offered them in the temple. The same as that of the Jews. It's because they are the Jews, the original Jews. Before it went over there and they migrated. Things moved around. They had the custom of sacrificing the firstborn, the same as the Jews, till it was done away by Abraham or Moses. They had also the rite of circumcision. Their temples were in the form of a cross and faced the 4 cardinal points. Their language has many Greek and Hebrew words in it. They practiced auricular confession. They have a sacred and select word like the Indian Om, which is never spoken, but what it is, I do not find mentioned. So y'all know what that is. Please let me know. Shout out. Number 13. The union of the Jewish and the Christian mythos in one system instead of their division into two systems at once proves that they cannot have been brought to Mexico at different and distant periods. You see? So they have the original in its one form before it gets split off into two. So we've gone through this, right? Because we understand that Moses and everybody in their understandings and how they went as far as their beliefs before it was split, it was different. It wasn't what we have now. Okay, and so by understanding that, they understood the male and the female principles. It wasn't just about the male and it wasn't just about the female. It was about understanding both. And he's showing here that in Mexico we have that, while everywhere else we show the division of the religion in its pure original form. Had this been the case, there would have been two religions, and in all other cases in opposition to one another. It is wonderful circumstances that the Jews coming from the city of Egypt built by Alexandria should have forgot to bring with them the knowledge of letters and iron, and still more wonderful that the Christian monks coming in later day should have had equally bad memories. So again, right there, what's going on too is he's saying that if the Egyptians did settle North America or any America aspect, then they would have brought the iron or understanding of iron as well, and letters, but it's all hieroglyphs here, baby. So that shows it's more recent than America itself. It's still more wonderful that the Christian monks coming in a later day should have had equally bad memories. All that was necessary was for those Jews to have told the skillful smelters of metals that by melting the lumps of their native iron in a wood fire, they would get iron and steel. So you see, that's a great point. The identity of the Mexican and Chinese of North Indian mythos being unquestionable attempts have been made in several periodical publications to account for their similarity by supposing that the Mexicans were the colonies fleeing from the arms of Mohammedan or Tartarian conquerors. But the writers do not tell us how the Jewish and Christian doctrines came to be found in America, mixed most intimately together, and also with the idolatry of North India and Greece. Other writers contend that these colonists were Mongol or Tartar conquerors, who, not contented with the conquest of China, conquered America also. But this leaves all the great difficulties I have stated above unremoved. It is most wonderful thing that these Tartarian heroes did not take with them the knowledge of iron and letters, and that they, being Mohammedans, should convey the Christian religion to the Mexicans instead of that of Muhammad. Oh, so easy to defeat those little fantasies. So, it is also wonderful that they should take with them the knowledge of the horse and the ass, though they did not take these animals themselves. Pictures of them being seen everywhere, mixed with their other hieroglyphs, and, what is still more, as the reader will instantly see, mixed most intimately with the Judean mythos, a hero mounted on an ass or a horse, sometimes carrying a sword, sometimes a cross. It is impossible, on viewing them, not to recollect the procession of Jesus Christ on the ass into Jerusalem. The mythos are evidently identical, but their variations show that they are not copies, though they have plenty of pictures of the horse, the animal, be it observed, noticed in the Revelation. They have no knowledge of the elephant or camel, but these were not in the Revelation, were no part of the mythos. They have no sheep, but they have an animal like it, which they call the llama or lamb. No part of the Mexican hieroglyphs is more striking than the exhibition of the horse or ass, for some are doubtful, animals, totally unknown in a state of nature to the Americans. That's BS. I refer to the plates figures. Faria y Sosua. The Jesuit says that when the Portuguese arrived in the Azores, they found the statue cut on the side of a mountain of a man on horseback, wearing a cloak, his left hand on the horse's mane, his right pointing to the west, with an inscription on the lower rock, but not understood. It is necessary to observe here that tribes, both of Negroes and bearded men, were found in South America. The Codex Vaticanus, Volume 2, is marked 3738. The plates in it are numbered to 146, but the explanation goes only to plate 92 in either English or Spanish. The explanation purports to being in Volume 6 on page 155 of Lord Kingsborough's work. My reader has only to look to the figures of the crucifixes which I have given, figure 12 and 14, and to reflect for one moment upon the admitted anxiety of the Spaniards and the popes to keep the knowledge of these things from the European world, to see why the explanation of the Codex Vaticanus ends with plate 92. The remainder has no doubt been suppressed to avoid the necessity of giving an explanation of the crucifixes. So you see, even right now, the Codex well, maybe not right now, but at that time, the Codex Vaticanus, Volume 2, they have it numbered up to 146 plates, but they only go to plate 92. And so leading Lord Kingsborough, and apparently figure 12 and 14, which there's no figures in this book, so that's what's crazy. Yeah, they're cutting it out in this book for some reason, this copy. Upon the admitted anxiety, explanation. So they have to give an explanation, and they wasn't going to, and they still don't want to this day, I don't think. I don't know if they have or not. Why? Because it just kills everything about their false fantasy being over there. It didn't happen over there. It happened over here. We everywhere meet with the Mexican divine names ending in tel, as Dios, that is, Dio, or God. Has been observed by Lord Kingsborough, as well as by almost all the Spanish authors, that the Mexican language is so full of Hebrew words as to be almost Hebrew. Now, when they're speaking about this too, which language are they speaking about? Are they speaking Nahuatl? So are they saying that the Nahuatl is straight Mexican language? Looks as so, We have seen the God everywhere crucified and suspended from the cross. We have found the sacred animal of llama or sheep. We have found the mythos of the crucified Savior. We have found everything, at last, to center in the Son. The word tl is confessed, not to be understood by the Mexicans nor by the Spaniards who call it, for that reason, merely a termination. All these matters are considered. I think it may be the same word as the tla, the Hebrew name for the sign of the zodiac, Agnes or Aries. In Hebrew it means, when spelt with the ta, tl, hanged or suspended. I believe it meant crucified by hanging on a cross. It was originally Buddha, as noticed before, for the same reason that the word meaning 650 was applied to him. It was in succession applied to the God of wisdom, to the Lamb, his second emblem, and to the crucified God, Krishna. 14. All the Mosaic history is to be found in China according to Monsieur Perove, in which he only repeats what was before pointed out by Joron, de Guinness, etc. The Chinese historians relate that one of their ancient despots endeavored to destroy their old records, but that a copy of their history was called Chao King, escaped. That book treats of the terrestrial paradise, its rivers, waters of immortality, its admirable trees, fall of the angels, and of man, and of the appearance of that at that moment of mercy. That's all there. You see, they're talking about America. Also of the Sabbath, confusion of tongues, the manna in the wilderness, the Trinity, and of the Holy One in the West, who was an incomprehensible, and the one with the Tien. It says that the world cannot know the Tien except by the Holy One, and only can offer a sacrifice acceptable to the Chang Ti. What does that sound like, y'all? The nations are waiting for him like plants for a refreshing shower. The Tien is the Holy One, invisible. Yao, the ineffable, and the Holy One is the Tien made visible in teaching men. Okay, Quetzalcoatl, right? The morning star. All this was taught by Confucius 550 years before Christ. Okay, so it didn't come from Christ, is what we're saying. We way before that. America way before that. And then it got taken over there to China. You see what I'm saying? Then it was understood over there, and then Christ came about. But they don't want to talk about that. That's the problem. Like, all these religions don't want to educate themselves and learn about this, because it demolishes what they believe in the first place as far as accurate history. And that's unfortunate. I understand that, but why not just accept that you was taught wrong? It's okay. Ancient inscriptions state the Jews to have come into China about the time of Confucius. This is probably the arrival of a colony or doctrine of a new incarnation going forth from the western Ayodhya. The secret doctrine of the renewed incarnation seems, by being misunderstood, to have operated with them precisely as it did with their Indian and Tibetan neighbors, for they are the Tibetan or Buddhist faith, into which all these doctrines dovetail perfectly. These facts and many more are detailed from different authors by the learned Nimrod, All these things, good people, like Nimrod, suppose were taught to the Tartars and Chinese by the lost tribes of Samaria. Those tribes are most useful people. They account for every difficulty. In the east, in the west, in the north, in the south, they are always ready at hand. Here is all the Jewish and the Christian mythos amalgamated precisely as it is in Mexico, in Tibet, North India, and South India, all carrying with it proofs of the almost universal prevalence or dissemination. But notwithstanding that we find remnants of this mythos everywhere, the actual character of which cannot be doubted, yet in the respective countries where they are found, the system is obsolete. They are remnants of an almost forgotten system, you see? Only remnants. They everywhere carry traits of the system of regeneration, or of the cycles recorded in the old druidical cycles or cyclopean monuments found along with them, the origin of which is acknowledged to be totally unknown. Yeah, okay. There cannot be any doubt that they have all flowed from the same fountain, have the same origin, and the only question will be whether they flowed from the kingdom of the West, which Herodotus could not find, and Alexander thought it not worth his while to notice, or from the kingdom of Ayodhya of India, with its capital probably, as appears from its ruins, once the largest in the world, a city larger than London, the capital of an empire more extensive than Europe. There is scarcely a page of Lord Kingsborough's work which does not exhibit proofs of the anxiety of the Spanish government to suppress the information which I have just now detailed, and which does not, and still to this day, that it comes to us through the medium of the most unwilling of witnesses. Listen, guys, if they didn't want us to have this, to know the truth, we wouldn't have it. They're waiting for us to reclaim what is ours. But it comes with knowledge. Okay? We have to come together as a nation of people to stand up and take back what is ours. You want your own system, you stand up and claim it, knowing what you are. There's no denying it anymore. There's nothing to be scared of. All you have to do is have the wisdom and stand up together. All we have to do is come together. Every contrivance which was possible was restored in order to prevent its arrival in Europe, and this accounts for the extraordinary and systematic opposition to the admission of strangers into New Spain. All people likely to be intelligent, such as physicians, persons suspected of heresy, etc., were prohibited from going thither. Okay? They weren't allowing them to come over here. You understand that? The reason assigned by the Spanish government was that they were prevented going, that they might not create disputes and prevent conversions. What conversions? To Christianity? Come on, guys. The author of the notes to Lord Kingsborough's book says that he believes that the Jews colonized America and held it for 1,000 years, and that they introduced, as it must have been along with their own, the Christian rite into the religion of the Mexicans, who had never heard of Christianity, to show their hatred of Christianity and to turn it into ridicule. Oh my gosh. And that it was for this reason that they established the Christian doctrines along with those of the Jews, such as the resurrection, ascension, etc. The passage is so extraordinary that I think the writer must have meant it for a joke. See? Exactly. The close connection between the Americas and the Old World was long ago seen, notwithstanding all the exertions of the Spaniards to keep mankind in the dark, and fruitless endeavors were made by Grotius and others to find a cause for it. An account of them may be seen in Basnage. It is there observed that one of the districts has a German name, Estotland, that the name of a young sheep is Lam, that one of their gods is called Theut, and one of their kings, Theuk. Evidently the same name. That their great creative principle was called Pachakama. Biakama, that is, Bi-akam, the wisdom of divine love. That they baptize their children in the form of the cross and have a notion of the Trinity, that they adorn their idols with the cross and mitre, that they have a kind of your Christ, that virgins consecrated to God make effigies of paste and honey, which they consecrate with much ceremony and afterward distribute to the people who believe they eat the body of their God. The people of North America were thought by Penn to have an unaccountable likeness to the Jews, and the Mashachete were thought to be found in Massachusetts. Tibet is called Tangutia. This is evidently Ae Dangut, the country of Dangut. The close similarity of the Trinitarian and other doctrines of the Tibetans to those of the Romish Christians we have seen. It is surely a very extraordinary thing to find the Peruvian triune god called Danga, evidently the same as the god of Tibet, both in name and character. The Mexican courts are shown to have had exactly the same number of judges as those of the Jews, that their sacred numbers were exactly the same, and that both nations kept fast for exactly the same number of days. Lord Kingsborough says, the common law of every state in Europe has been confessedly modeled after the Mosaic law. This is a very important observation, and I think its truth will not be disputed, but I think there is no other way of accounting for it than to go to my primeval nation. The common law in most states is evidently older than Christianity. We are told that St. Augustine brought Christianity into this island in the year 596, but was there no Christianity in the time of Constantine or before? Lord Kingsborough says, the affinity between the Mexican and the Hebrew laws is greater than between the latter and those of any nation with which we are acquainted. They circumcised with a stone knife, the use of which was expressly ordered. It is remarkable that the circumcision of the Jews should have been performed with a knife made of stone, which is emphatically noticed in the Bible. Now, Easter Islands may be considered to be a part of America. The most remarkable curiosity in this island is a number of colossal statues on the east side of the island, where seen the ruins of the 3 platforms of stonework, on each of which had stood 4 of these large statues, but they were all fallen down from the 2 of them, and 1 from the 3rd. They were broken and defaced by the fall. One was 15 feet long and 6 feet broad over the shoulders. Each statue had on its head a large cylindric stone of red color, wrought perfectly round. Others measured nearly 27 feet and upwards of 8 feet on the shoulders, and still larger one was seen standing, the shade of which was sufficient to shelter all the party of Captain Cook, who reports this from the sun. The workmanship is rude, but not bad, nor are the features on the face ill-formed. The ears are long, according to the disproportion practiced in this land, and the bodies have hardly anything of human figure about them. How these islanders, wholly unacquainted with any mechanical power, could raise such stupendous figures and afterwards place large cylindric stones upon their heads is truly wonderful. It is observed that the most probable conjecture is that the stone is factitious, meaning that they made the stone. It wasn't carved like that. So they used earth, and then it's so old it's just become fossilized into stone like it is now. The island is about 10 or 12 leagues in circumference and must be in the Gulf of California. But see Cook and Foster's Voyage, March 1774. The Encyclopedia Londinensis says the names of the 2 statues left standing are Dago and Darico. Here we have Dagon and Taurus. Surely nothing can be more curious than these statues. Who placed them here, and when were they set up? 17. Everyone must remember the accounts of the perfect horror with which the unhappy Mexicans viewed the first horses, which the Spaniards took over to their country. This I will now account for. It appears from Lord Kingsborough's book, etc., that they had all the mythos which had been so fully explained of the old world, or should we say the new world. The Immaculate Conception, the Crucifixion, the Resurrection after 3 days, the expectation of the return of their crucified Savior, etc., etc. Every Indian inquirer knows that the last avatar was always expected by the people of Java to come mounted on a white horse. Now we're talking about the Apocalypse, Revelation. Now, in several of the Mexican hieroglyph pictures, though their owners knew nothing of the horse, an animal, which might be either a horse or an ass, is painted. In these same pictures, the other parts of the mythos, the crucifixion, etc., are described. From this, it is evident that although they were not able to convey the horse over the sea, yet they could convey every part of the mythos. The result of this was that when the Spaniards arrived in flying machines, or machines propelled by the winds, which would be ships on the wings of the wind, across the boundless ocean or from heaven, their commander mounted on the unknown animal described in their ancient pictures to be that on which the promised God was to come, and carrying in his hands thunder and lightning, with which he destroyed his enemies at miles' distance from him. he was believed to be the last avatar. Lord Kingsborough gives a very interesting account of the effect which this superstition or belief had upon their conduct, taking away from most of them from devotion. All wished to resist their god, mounted on his horse and surrounded by thunder and lightning, and from others, through fear, all power, thus giving to their cruel enemies an easy victory. I cannot conceive it possible to devise anything more conclusive of the truth of my whole system than this. All this accounts for numbers of circumstances relating to the conduct of Montezuma and his people, which have hitherto been utterly unintelligible. And I think it seems evident that if the miscreants from Spain had really understood their own case, they would have had nothing to do but to have quietly taken possession of the whole empire as its last avatar and newly arrived god. Well, indeed, might Peter Martyr, Las Casas, and Torquemada be puzzled with the horse, the actual horse of the revelation, in a country where the people had not the knowledge of the animal, or indeed of any animal of the old world, instead of accepting the passage of the empire peaceably offered to them. By a most absurd and extraordinary mistake, the Spaniards determined to terrify the people by ill usage, the account of which is given in the Antiquities of Mexico. 18. Colonel Todd states that the mountains above Tibet, the highest ridge of Asia to be called Andes, these must have been the countries of Tungusians. It is impossible on reading this not to recollect the Andes in the Tanga of Peru, and it is equally impossible to attribute this paranomasia and the other circumstances already described to accident. They're saying there's no accident here. They can see that it's a replica. To account for this, I look into ancient histories and I adopt the first rational and philosophical cause which is recorded. And if you've gone through with me on anything Anacalypsis, you know that Godfrey Higgins don't play. He goes very deep. And this is pretty sound research, y'all. If it's coming out of Godfrey Higgins, you already know what's up. These are some of the best, without a lot of conjecture. And without the difficulty I find it in the communication formed by the island of Atlantis of Plato, for the subsequent submerging of such an island or continent is neither improbable nor irrational, but when the antecedent circumstances are considered, a dry historical fact, carrying probability on the face of it, it is no more improbable than the effects we see produced by volcanoes every day. Okay? Understanding what's going on? Okay? Do you understand? Atlantis? Where's that? America. How? We see the same effects produced by volcanoes every day. It is neither impossible nor improbable that when the Atlantis sunk, something of the same kind should have happened in the northern Pacific Ocean. The legend of the sinking of a very large island is now well known in China and Japan, and in both places of an old festival is kept to celebrate the escape of an excellent prince called Birun. I cannot help suspecting an identity of mythos or an identity of fact. I apprehend if the whole or great part of the Polynesian islands constituted the highest grounds of a large continent which sunk, the effect would be, when the sinking took place, to raise up the water so as to drown all the inhabitants, and after a short time to subside and leave the points of the mountains dry as islands. After all, a great difficulty must be allowed to exist in all the speculations on this subject arising from the fact that there are none of the animals of the continent found in the other. So see this book from Mr. Cuvier's opinion on the part of this subject. Now, the Mexicans in their histories already say that they arrived from the present country from the west. They always persist more strenuously that it was from the west they came, and they describe towns on the coast where they remained for many years in their progress to their present situation, the ruins of which they assert are yet to be seen. They say they came across the sea from another country. Now, was this Atlantis or not? It is very desirable that the remains of the towns should be sought for. Lord Kingsborough has gone to an enormous length in proving that the Mexican rites, ceremonies, etc., etc., were almost precisely the same as those of the Jews, and that they must consequently have been brought by the Jews to Mexico. But one most important observation offers itself on this. We possess what we believe to be the knowledge of all the Jewish rites, history, etc., etc., in Syria. But this is not the way all these things are known by the Americans. All the things said to have taken place in Western Syria, both the Jews and Christians, are said to have been acted in America, and the case, in a great measure, is the same in India and China. You see what I'm saying? So what he's sitting over here saying is that, yeah, we know all about them. We possess what we believe to be all the knowledge of them. You know what I'm saying? But how do they? Like everything, right? There's the same standing still of the sun, the same populifugia, the same deluge and persons saved in a ship, the same immaculate conception, the same crucifixion and resurrection, but they were all in the American country, not in Syria. Not in Syria. Not in Syria. Now, it is very improbable that if the Jews of Western Judea or of Moses had gone in a body from their old country, they would ever wish or permit their history to be located in the new one, towers of Babel to be built, waters to be passed, or places to be shown where the sun stood still. Nothing can account for all this except that, in all countries, including among the Western Judea, it was the figurative description of the renewed avatars. Figurative description of renewed avatars. Everything originally is in America, and everything over there is a figurative description of renewed avatars. It seems to me that the mythos, which I have shown to have universally prevailed, accounts in a satisfactory manner, with one exception, for all the difficulties. Parts of it we have seen everywhere, a small part of it in one place and a small part in another, but all, including the Jewish, the same mythos. The discovery of the same system in America as that in South India, in North India, in Tibet, in Western Syria, etc., proves that at some extremely remote era, the same mythos must have prevailed, and the variations which we find, whilst at the same time the general character is preserved, are what we may naturally expect would arise as time advanced. You see what I'm saying? Everything that's transpiring is what would naturally, we could expect, would arise as it has progressed the time. Things change, they forget, they lose sight, they expand over time. The religion mutates as we see. What we have now are the debris of the original system. Number 19. We must recollect that the neglect to teach the Mexicans the arts of writing and making iron cannot be attributed merely to a few stray mariners and fishermen blown across the ocean. The knowledge of the Americans, if carried to them at all in later times, must have been carried by regular colonies from Greece who taught them the rites and name of Bacchus, of colonies from Syria who taught them all the minute parts of the Judean mythos, of colonies from Tartary and China, who taught them the knowledge of the mythoses of those countries, of colonies from Europe, who taught them the modern but not Baptist Christianity. So you see what they're saying? What he's saying here, they would have had to come over here and teach them all these mythos of all these different nations, and then have them intertwine and change everything that they originally were doing into now an intermixture of all of these mythos put together, which directly match up to the Jews. How much sense does that make to y'all? That don't make no sense. Is there a human being so credulous as to believe that all these colonies or parties of migrations following one another, time after time, should have admitted to convey the knowledge of iron and letters? So he's saying that they would have taught them all of this religious stuff, all of these practices, but y'all ain't gonna teach them about no iron and letters? Come on, cuz, it don't make no sense. I am sure no person will be found to believe this. Then, what are we to believe? But that one great and learned race held all these doctrines as taught by me in a period of the world when the intercourse between the old and the new world was easily compared with what it is at this time. The one exception alluded to above is the difficulty of accounting for means by which the system reached America. To meet this, may we not have recourse to the formerly named island of Atlantis, of the submersion of which we are informed by Plato, and which I suppose almost connected the two worlds? It was probably so near both, or it was it, that, in the frail boats of those days, colonies could pass, but in which the large animals could not be conveyed. Of course, the submersion must have taken place and cut off the communication between the two worlds before the knowledge of letters and the use of iron. It cannot be believed that if ever the Mexicans had been told of the existence of use of iron, excellent refiners and smelters of metals as they were, that they would not instantly have obtained it from their mountains, where it is found in its native state. I shall be asked how they could pass in any great numbers without the means of conveying the horse, the cow, the sheep. For if the two worlds were nearly connected by an intermediate island or islands, the passage of the animals would have taken place. I admit the force of the argument in its fullest extent, as I do the difficulty of accounting for the extraordinary fact that there were none of the animals of the old world in America. However, at last, an intimate connection between the two worlds must be admitted to have existed, and to have existed before the knowledge of iron or letters, and the countries the Mexicans came from. Some persons have thought that the Americans were colonies who passed by the north, where the continents join, or nearly join, and to the question why they have not the horse, it may be replied that if the natives of Tartary or China immigrated by north, and were actually these people in the first place, is what he's getting at. Not to saying that they didn't, they came, ain't nobody doubting that. We had these people come, we got clear documentation of, people coming and fighting and demolishing the Hebrew nations here. Of course, they didn't go by all the names that are given to us later in the Bible. They had separate and distinct names native to this nation, because that's what it is. But either way, it's okay. But what he's saying is that the natives of Tartary or China and being immigrated here and then being the Hebrews is not the case. In the neighborhood of the Arctic Circle, as it must have been in that route, there is reason to believe that the horse could not have conveyed through this cold climate, perhaps could have not lived there. It is said that the northeast of Tartary is too cold for this animal, and that there are none. If we admit this, then we may suppose that the migration took place from China, where the Hebrew language was spoken and where the Hebrew and Christian systems flourished. See, he still won't let it go, as it has been shown to have done in a very early period. And if the immigrants went from China, we may thus account for their going without taking with them the knowledge of syllabic writing. So here we go. If we suppose a body of Japanese or Chinese amounting only to a few thousand on their arrival in Mexico after journeying for 40 or 50 years, we may readily suppose that they would increase to 200 or 300 millions in 500 or 600 years in that fine soil and climate. But to suppose we account for their ignorance of letters and the want of horses, cows, and etc. in this manner, this will not account for the ignorance of iron, and at the same time for the knowledge of the mythoses of all the nations which I have just now enumerated. Did you hear him? Of all the nations. The mythos of all the nations. Why? Because it originated here, yo. The Gulf of Mexico is the true Fertile Crescent. Y'all gotta go back to my origins of civilization from what we going through right now. Brazil de Berg's translations. And satisfactorily to account for this, I am convinced we must ultimately go to my hypothesis, which naturally and easily explains the difficulties. Lord Kingsborough's work is unquestionably the most magnificent ever undertaken by an individual. It is indeed an honor to his order and to his country. The bringing together into the one view, by means of lithographic copies, the different manuscripts from different and distant countries will prove indeed, has already proved, of the greatest importance to science, and must greatly aid the philosopher in his inquiries. So I hope y'all enjoyed this one. There's not much I can say else than that. I know this was long, but hey, Godfrey Higgins got us. Anacalypsis Volume 1 and Volume 2, baby. From a misunderstanding to an understanding. Let's go.